Schools told us about kings and castles, but they left out the weird stuff. People did things back then that sound crazy today. Some funny, some gross, all real. These 100 medieval facts weren't in your history book, but they should have been. Forget everything you've been told about medieval people having rotten teeth and terrible breath. The truth is, many medieval folks actually had surprisingly healthy teeth, probably healthier than yours after your last Halloween candy binge. Here's the shocking part. Sugar, the main culprit behind tooth decay, was incredibly rare and expensive in medieval times. Only the super wealthy could afford it, which meant most people's diets weren't destroying their teeth like ours do today. No wonder they didn't need dental insurance. Their biggest sweet treat was a honeycomb if they were lucky. Instead of fancy toothbrushes, people used twigs with frayed ends or cloth rags, scrubbing their teeth with salt, charcoal, or crushed herbs. Some even use ground-up eggshells or burnt rosemary. Medieval dental hygiene, like a DIY crafting project, meets your bathroom routine. Archaeological remains tell the story best. Many medieval skulls show teeth in much better condition than the Victorians, who had access to more modern dental care, but also loads of sugar. The medieval diet of coarse bread, vegetables, and meat actually helped clean teeth naturally as people chewed. Medieval people understood that bad breath wasn't attractive either. They chewed herbs like mint, fennel, or cloves to freshen their breath. And just like dental health, medieval warfare wasn't quite what most people picture either. That shiny, clanking knight in full-plate armor? Pure Hollywood. Those full-metal suits didn't show up until the 1400s. Before that, knights wore chainmail, linked metal rings over thick padding called a gambeson, basically a quilted jacket stuffed with whatever soft material they had. Chainmail was flexible enough to move, sit, or even run in. The idea that knights couldn't get up if they fell? Total nonsense. They were trained athletes who had to ride, fight, and survive. Armor was custom-made, often fancy if you had the gold. Some even had engraved crests or came from Milan, yes, like a medieval designer suit. When full plate finally arrived, it wasn't as heavy as you'd think, around 50 pounds. Today, soldiers often carry more. Knights trained for this since childhood. By the time they wore full armor, they moved like gymnasts in steel. And armor's just one myth people believe about medieval life. Forget what you've heard about medieval peasants being dirty and sad all the time. Life was hard, yes, but they weren't just sitting around waiting to die. Peasants got a lot of days off, up to 150 or even 200 each year. Between church holidays, feasts, and festivals, they had more time off than most people today. Many had their own small farms or rented land for a fair price. They grew food, raised animals, and sold extra at the market. Some even did well enough to save money and live comfortably. Villages were full of life. There were big parties with music, dancing, games, and lots of beer. It wasn't boring at all. Peasants also had some rights. Lords couldn't just kick them out or raise taxes for no reason. Some peasants even took their lords to court and won. The idea of dirty, sad peasants mostly came from writers in later times. Back then, people bathed in rivers, cleaned their homes, and wore nice clothes for church or special days. Of course, not everything was rosy. Some medieval beliefs were pretty dark. Being left-handed in medieval times was like having a target painted on your back. People genuinely believed that left-handed folks were touched by the devil himself, and they weren't shy about expressing this opinion. The fear wasn't just superstition. The Latin word for left is sinister, which also means evil or unlucky. Talk about language setting you up for failure from day one. This wasn't just a fun fact teachers shared. It shaped how society treated left-handed people for centuries. Parents would go to extreme lengths to fix their left-handed children. Kids caught using their left hand were punished, sometimes harshly. Teachers would tie students' left hands behind their backs or hit them with sticks when they automatically reached with the wrong hand. Some parents even broke their children's left hands to force them to use the right one. The church reinforced these beliefs. Religious texts described the devil sitting on God's left side, and left-handed people were thought to have the devil whispering in their ear. In medieval artwork, the damned are always shown on the left side of Jesus at the Last Judgment, while the saved stand on his right. This persecution wasn't limited to children. Left-handed adults faced discrimination in everything from jobs to marriage prospects. Some guilds refused to train left-handed apprentices, believing they'd bring bad luck. Being naturally left-handed was like having spawn of Satan written on your resume. Even handshakes became a right-handed custom, showing your weapon hand was empty and offering the good hand for greetings. Left-handed people had to adapt constantly in a world designed entirely for right-handed people, all while being suspected of supernatural wickedness. But supernatural fears extended beyond handedness to architecture itself. When you hear medieval castle, you probably picture massive stone walls and imposing towers. But for most of the medieval period, castles were actually wooden structures built on mounds of dirt. The first castles were motte and bailey designs, a wooden tower, the keep, built on a man-made hill, the motte, with a courtyard, the bailey, surrounded by a wooden fence. These could be built quickly, sometimes in just a few weeks, using local materials and peasant labor. Medieval construction, less architectural masterpiece, more, let's pile dirt really high and stick a wooden building on top. Stone castles took decades to build and cost fortunes. A single castle could eat up a king's entire annual income for years. Many lords simply couldn't afford them. Some castles were started in stone but finished in wood when the money ran out. A medieval version of maxing out your credit card during a home renovation. The famous castles you see in fairy tales and tourist books are mostly from the late medieval period, the 1400s and 1500s. By then, they were more about showing off wealth than actual defense. These later castles often had huge windows, decorative gardens, and comfortable living quarters. Basically medieval McMansions with defensible walls. Even the real castles weren't impregnable fortresses. Siege weapons constantly evolved to overcome castle defenses. By the time cannons arrived on the battlefield, castle walls became more decorative than defensive. Many medieval lords spent more time negotiating surrenders than actually defending their castles. What we call castles today were often just fortified manor houses, fancy homes with a few defensive features. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a gated community with really good walls and a moat instead of a pool. But medieval defenses went beyond architecture to some truly bizarre legal practices. In medieval courts, animals weren't just farm property, they were potential criminals. Pigs, goats, and even insects faced formal trials with witnesses and defense attorneys when accused of crimes. A notorious case from 1386 involved a pig that attacked a child in France. The pig received its own lawyer who argued it couldn't understand human laws. The court disagreed and sentenced it to death by hanging in human clothes. Talk about bringing home the bacon to the gallows. It wasn't just mammals in the medieval justice system. In 1478, a swarm of beetles was put on trial for destroying crops in Switzerland. When they failed to appear, shocking absolutely no one, they were found guilty in absentia and officially banished from the region. In 1522, rats were put on trial for destroying barley crops. Their court-appointed lawyer successfully argued that his clients couldn't attend court because the town's cats posed a danger to them. The case was dismissed. First recorded instance of "my cat ate my defendant." While courts prosecuted four-legged criminals, people found unusual uses for human waste in their daily chores. Before modern detergents, medieval folks turned to a surprising cleaning agent: human urine. This wasn't just a weird folk practice. It was an organized industry with urine collectors gathering this valuable liquid. Urine contains ammonia, which works as a natural bleaching agent and breaks down grease stains. Professional cloth workers called fullers paid good money for large quantities. Medieval laundry tip: for those tough stains, nothing beats a bucket of yesterday's toilet trips. In larger towns, public pee collection spots were designated where men could contribute to the communal cleaning supply. One Fuller's Guild in London recorded purchasing over 50 gallons of urine weekly from local taverns, proving beer and clean clothes shared a surprising connection. The cleaning process involved soaking dirty clothes in vats of stale urine, then stomping on them like grapes in winemaking. Medieval career guidance: you can be a blacksmith, a baker, or professionally stomp on clothes and pee. Choose wisely. While people navigated the aromatic challenges of cleaning their garments, fashion trends for women reached new heights, literally. In the 1400s, noble European women abandoned subtle marriage signals in favor of the hennin, a cone-shaped hat that could tower up to 3 feet high. These dramatic headpieces resembled unicorn horns wrapped in expensive silken veils. The taller and more elaborate your hennin, the higher your social status. Some noble women wore hennons so tall they couldn't pass through doorways without bending sideways. Medieval problems. We need wider doorways, Harold. My hat can't fit through the chapel entrance anymore. These hats weren't just fashion statements, but clear marriage markers. Unmarried women were forbidden from wearing them in public, making the hennon a highly visible hands-off signal. Constructing these towering cones required wooden frames covered with precious fabrics, often decorated with pearls, gold thread, or peacock feathers. Women needed servants to help them dress and had to carefully navigate any breeze that might topple their precarious headwear. No ring, no problem. Just strap a silk tower to your head and watch everyone bump into the ceiling. While married women balanced towers on their heads, medieval medicine had its own balancing act with unusual animal remedies. When medieval folks caught colds or sore throats, they turned to an unusual pharmacy, the local pond. The prescription? Catch a live frog, wrap it in linen cloth, and tie it around your neck like a slimy pendant. Medieval fashion tip: accessorize with amphibians for that "I'm desperate not to die of a common cold" look. Medieval doctors believed frogs possessed cold energy that could draw fever and inflammation out of the human body. The frog absorbed the illness through the skin while the patient got better. The moment of frog death supposedly marked when the illness transferred completely from person to amphibian. If the frog died quickly, the patient would recover faster. Nothing says "get well soon" like timing the death of your neck frog. How's your cold? Still bad, my frog is on day 3 and kicking. Regional variations existed throughout Europe. In Germany, people split the frog open and applied it directly to the throat. In northern England, they dried dead frogs, ground them into powder, and mixed them into drinks. One medical text recommended wearing 3 frogs simultaneously for particularly severe cases. The medieval equivalent of "take 2 aspirin" was "wear 3 frogs and hope for the best." While frogs served as living medicine, parents found equally disturbing ways to shape their children's appearance. Long before plastic surgery, medieval noble families had their own methods for achieving the perfect look, reshaping their babies' skulls. Among aristocrats, having the right head shape wasn't just vanity. It was considered a mark of intelligence and proper breeding. These metal helmets were custom made by blacksmiths and lined with felt to prevent chafing. Infants wore them up to 20 hours daily, sometimes until age 3. Honey, little Bartholomew's head is looking a bit peasant-shaped. Get the skull press. In France, a rounded skull indicated nobility, while in parts of Germany, an elongated back of the head was preferred. Spanish aristocrats wanted their sons to have high foreheads. Medieval baby fashion was less cute onesie and more tiny torture device. Records show that King Henry VI of England wore a gold-plated skull shaper until age 4. The practice wasn't without consequences. Headaches, visual problems, and even brain damage could result from aggressive reshaping. But hey, at least he looked great in profile on those coins. While parents fussed over their children's heads, everyone in medieval towns faced more immediate concerns about daily hygiene. Medieval sanitation wasn't just primitive, it was a full-blown public health disaster flowing directly into drinking water. The typical town toilet, called a garderobe, was essentially a wooden seat suspended over water. Despite its fancy French name, literally clothes keeper, these facilities were anything but elegant. In London alone, over 200 public garderobes hung over the Thames by the 14th century. The river became so polluted that Parliament once had to adjourn because members couldn't breathe through the stench. King Edward III described it as an abominable sight and a terrible odor. Medieval London tourism slogan: "Come for the plague, stay for the river that's more sewage than water." Castle garderobes featured stone seats built into walls with shafts dropping waste into moats or rivers. Some castles proudly advertised having 15 toilet holes, allowing knights to handle their business side by side. Nothing builds brotherhood like sharing bathroom time with your fellow soldiers. The worst part? The same rivers contaminated with human waste were used for drinking water downstream. Towns would collect water from the clean side while dumping waste on the other side. People living downstream suffered illness rates 3 times higher than those upstream. Upstream neighbor wasn't just annoying, it was a medieval health plan. Daily life requires many practical solutions to common problems, including keeping oneself reasonably clean and presentable. Before minty toothpaste, medieval folks had to get creative with dental hygiene. Their solution? Grab some fireplace ashes, mix them with strong wine, and scrub away. This gritty, bitter paste was surprisingly effective, if you could stand the taste. Morning breath versus wine-soaked chimney residue. A tough choice every medieval morning. Wood ash contains potassium hydroxide, a natural cleaner that helped remove food particles. The alcohol in wine killed some bacteria, offering basic protection against tooth decay. People would dip linen cloths or twigs with frayed ends into this mixture and scrub vigorously. A 12th century medical text recommended ashes of burnt rosemary mixed with the strongest wine, used daily to maintain teeth white as pearls. One nobleman's diary described the taste as death itself visiting your mouth each morning. The first recorded instance of the cure is worse than the disease. Archaeological evidence shows this method wasn't entirely useless. Skulls from medieval grave sites often show less decay than expected, particularly among the upper classes. However, their teeth also show significant wear from the abrasive ash scrubbing. Their teeth were clean, but slowly being sanded away like medieval woodworking projects. While people struggled with dental hygiene, warriors were developing their own unique pre-battle preparations. Before heading into battle, medieval warriors had an unusual preparation ritual, rubbing garlic all over their bodies and armor. This wasn't just a way to keep vampires at bay, it was a serious spiritual and psychological tactic. Garlic was believed to possess powerful protective properties that could ward off evil spirits and give the wearer courage. Knights would crush cloves and rub the juice directly onto their skin or tuck whole bulbs into the gaps of their armor. Some even ate raw garlic by the handful before combat. Medieval pre-battle pep talk. Sharpen your sword, polish your shield, and don't forget to smell like last night's dinner. This practice had practical benefits too. The strong smell might have helped mask the fear sweat that naturally occurs before combat, preventing enemies and horses from sensing fear. Some historians suggest it also acted as an early form of psychological warfare. The overwhelming stench of hundreds of garlic-drenched warriors charging towards you would certainly be intimidating. Military records from the 100 Years' War mention French knights carrying garlic pouches as standard equipment. One English chronicle complained that French forces could be smelled from half a league away. Their battle cry may have been fierce, but their breath was fiercer. While warriors used garlic to fight external enemies, ordinary people had their own methods for combating invisible spiritual threats. Next time you cover your mouth while yawning, thank medieval superstition. People genuinely believed that an open-mouthed yawn created a direct portal for demons to enter your body. Covering your mouth wasn't just polite, it was essential spiritual protection. According to medieval religious texts, the soul temporarily left the body during a yawn, leaving it unguarded and vulnerable to possession. This belief was so widespread that parents taught children to make the sign of the cross immediately after seeing someone yawn nearby. Talk about peer pressure. Your yawn could doom us all to demonic attack. Thanks a lot, Steve. Church officials reinforced this fear, with some priests claiming they could see evil spirits hovering around yawning parishioners during sermons. One 12th century manuscript illustrated tiny demons sitting on the tongues of yawning monks during prayer services. The superstition varied by region. In parts of Spain, people believed yawning 7 times in a row guaranteed demon possession. German folklore claimed that souls could be permanently lost if someone died mid-yawn. English peasants wore special yawn amulets to protect themselves during sleep when unconscious yawning might occur. No one wanted to be the accidental demon delivery system for the village. This fear of yawn-based possession persisted well into the Renaissance, with even educated nobles carefully covering their mouths. While people guarded against spiritual dangers, those living in religious communities faced very specific rules about proper behavior. Monasteries weren't just places of prayer. They were pioneers of table manners with strict dining rules. These religious communities developed detailed codes covering everything from how loudly you could chew to the proper way to hold a spoon. The Rule of St. Benedict dedicated entire sections to proper eating behavior. Slurping your soup too loudly could get you punished with fewer rations at the next meal. Records show that in one French monastery, a monk was forced to eat alone for 3 days after making excessive noise with his porridge. Slurp too loud, lose your bread. Medieval monastery, where the only thing harder than the beds was the dining criticism. Many monasteries enforced completely silent meals, with monks using an elaborate system of hand signals to communicate. They had specific gestures for pass the salt, I need water, and even this fish is undercooked. One monastery handbook listed 63 different dining signals. Imagine mistaking the I need salt sign with the I've seen a vision of angels gesture. The reasoning behind these strict rules wasn't just about peace during meals. Monks believed that controlling small behaviors like eating habits helped develop spiritual discipline. The loudness of your soup slurping was seen as a direct reflection of your soul's condition. These monastic dining codes eventually influenced noble households. By the 1300s, European courts had adopted many monastery eating rules, bringing proper mealtime etiquette into fashion. However, dining etiquette wasn't the only way medieval authorities tried to control personal behavior. They also found creative ways to regulate people's physical appearance. Long before hipsters made facial hair fashionable, medieval governments were turning beards into cash cows. In several European kingdoms, your facial hair could cost you serious money depending on how fancy it looked. England's King Henry VIII introduced a beard tax in 1535 that scaled with social class. The more important you were, the more you paid for your facial fur. The tax wasn't just about money, it was a way to control appearance and enforce social hierarchies. Shaving wasn't just hygiene, it was tax planning. Sorry, dear, I can't afford the mustache this month. We're saving for a new cow. In Russia, Tsar Peter the Great took beard taxation to new heights. He personally shaved the beards of his shocked nobles at a welcome home party, then imposed a beard tax so severe that men had to carry a beard token, a copper or silver coin proving they'd paid the tax. Without it, your beard could be forcibly shaved on the spot by police. Records show that in Moscow alone, over 80,000 beard tokens were issued between 1705 and 1724. Different beard styles had different tax rates. A neatly trimmed merchant's beard cost 5 times less than a full peasant beard. The first government-issued receipt for your face. Medieval taxation wasn't the only strange aspect of daily life. The way people carried their personal belongings had its own quirks, too. Before pockets became standard, medieval women developed their own storage solution. Hidden pouches called chattels that hung beneath their dresses, accessible through slits in their outer garments. These fabric pouches were the medieval equivalent of a purse, wallet, and keychain all in one. Women attached them to belts worn under their dresses or tied them directly to their undergarments with ribbons. Some wealthy women had elaborate systems with multiple pouches for different items. Underskirt storage, the original anti-theft system. Is that a small sack of gold under your dress, or are you just happy to see me? It's my emergency cheese supply, actually. The contents of these pouches reveal fascinating details about daily medieval life. Archaeological finds have uncovered chattels containing everything from sewing needles and spices to love letters and medicinal herbs. One remarkably preserved pouch found in London contained keys, a silver thimble, and dried lavender, likely carried to mask the smell of medieval streets. These pouches were considered so personal that stealing one was a serious offense. Court records from 13th century England list punishments for chattel thieves that were nearly as severe as those for stealing horses. What are you in for? I pickpocketed a lady's underdress pouch. Ouch, I just murdered someone. Got off easier than you. The everyday habits of medieval people extended beyond their clothing into aspects of life we might find surprisingly unfamiliar. Sleep hasn't always been the straight 8-hour block we aim for today. Medieval people typically slept in 2 distinct segments called first sleep and second sleep, with a wakeful period in between. People would go to bed shortly after sunset and sleep for about 4 hours, wake for 1 to 2 hours around midnight, then return to sleep until dawn. This biphasic sleep pattern was so common that literature regularly references characters rising after their first sleep to do various activities. During this middle-of-the-night waking period, people weren't frustrated insomniacs. They considered this time normal and valuable. Midnight scrolling? Not new, just candlelit. What did you do during your midnight waking? Oh, just checked on the livestock, prayed, and conceived our 6th child. The usual Tuesday. What did medieval folks do during this nighttime break? Diaries mention praying, talking with bedmates, visiting neighbors, tending fires, or checking on animals. Some artisans even did light craft work by moonlight. Imagine your neighbor knocking at midnight. Sorry to disturb your between sleeps, but do you have any spare eggs? Rules and regulations govern many aspects of medieval life, from sleeping habits to the most unexpected areas of personal expression. What's the biggest distraction in your classroom today? In medieval universities, it wasn't smartphones. It was ridiculous footwear. In the 1300s, Oxford and Cambridge both passed regulations banning students from wearing poulains, shoes with toes so long and pointy they had to be stuffed with moss to keep their shape. These absurd shoes could stretch up to 24 inches beyond the foot, forcing wearers to adopt an awkward walking style. Court records show that at least 34 students were fined for wearing illegal footwear during a single term at Oxford. Fashion over function? Medieval students were already doing it. I failed my theology exam because I couldn't kneel to pray. My shoes kept poking the student in front of me. University authorities claimed these shoes caused multiple problems. Students tripped during academic processions, the points damaged wooden floors, and they were considered too vain for serious scholars. The pointy shoe trend wasn't just about fashion, it was about social status. Kings and nobles sometimes had points so long they needed chains attaching the tips to their knees so they could walk without tripping. Nothing says, "I'm rich," like shoes that require engineering solutions. Creative solutions to everyday problems were a hallmark of medieval life, particularly when it came to matters of health and healing. Long before modern medicine, battlefield medics and village healers turned to an unlikely ally in treating wounds and infections: the humble cabbage. These common garden vegetables weren't just for eating, they were a cornerstone of medieval first aid. Cabbage leaves would be carefully washed, lightly roasted over coals until soft and pliable, then applied directly to wounds, burns, or swollen joints. The still warm leaves were believed to draw out infection and reduce inflammation. Medieval medicine was literally a vegetable patch away. "I need bandages, stat." "Sorry, doctor, we're out, but the cabbage patch is full." The most surprising part? It actually worked. Somewhat. Modern analysis shows cabbage contains compounds with mild antibacterial properties and anti-inflammatory effects. The large, flexible leaves also made practical wound coverings that kept dirt out while allowing some airflow. In monasteries, cabbage patches were planted specifically for medicinal use, separate from kitchen gardens. Some monastic records show harvests of over 2,000 cabbage heads yearly just for the infirmary. The practice was so common that soldiers sometimes carried dried cabbage leaves in their packs, ready to be rehydrated and applied to battlefield injuries. Medicine didn't come in pills. It came in salad form. While these plant-based remedies were relatively harmless, other ingredients in medieval cookery posed far more serious risks to those who consumed them. That medieval bread you're picturing, it wasn't exactly the artisanal sourdough you might find at a fancy bakery. During hard times, and even some not-so-hard times, medieval bakers found creative ways to stretch their flour supplies by adding things that definitely weren't food. Chalk, ground bones, sawdust, and clay commonly made their way into medieval bread dough. These white powders helped make loaves look bigger and whiter, a sign of quality at the time. Records from 14th century London show that at least 65 bakers were punished for selling adulterated bread in a single year. That's not extra crunch in your sandwich. It's the taste of medieval entrepreneurship. This wasn't just an occasional practice during famines. Many bakers routinely added these fillers, especially in cities where bread was sold by weight rather than size. One clever inspection method involved dropping suspicious bread into water. Real bread would float, while bread loaded with mineral fillers would sink like a stone. Medieval food inspectors. The original sink or swim test, where bread, not witches, faced judgment. The health effects were serious. People who ate chalk-filled bread over many years developed stomach problems, constipation, and damaged teeth from grinding against the hard particles. Medieval dietitian advice: for stronger bones, drink milk, because your bread's already got plenty of chalk. In 1266, England passed the Assize of Bread Law, which mandated inspections and harsh penalties for fraudulent baking. First-time offenders were dragged through town on a hurdle. Repeat offenders could lose their ovens or be banned from baking altogether. While medieval bread could be hazardous to your health, other everyday consumables contained even more dangerous additives. Looking for a sweet taste and a quick mood lift? In medieval times, you might have reached for a special drink made with lead sugar, a compound created by soaking lead in vinegar. This concoction added a sweet flavor to wine, preserved fruits, and was even used as medicine. The drink gained popularity because lead acetate actually tastes sweet, earning it the nickname sugar of lead. Nobles used it to flavor wines and desserts, while doctors prescribed it as a treatment for melancholy and depression. Medieval antidepressant ad: feeling down? Try lead sugar. Side effects may include paralysis, insanity, and death, but you'll feel great for the first hour. The initial effects seem miraculous. People reported feeling more cheerful and energetic after drinking lead-sweetened wine. What they didn't realize was that they were experiencing the first stage of acute lead poisoning. Talk about a heavy metal addiction, and not the musical kind. Regular consumers develop tremors, headaches, abdominal pain, and eventually permanent nerve damage. Analysis of bones from medieval cemeteries shows lead levels up to 50 times higher than what we see in modern humans. Despite the known dangers by the late medieval period, lead sugar remained popular because nothing else could replicate its sweet taste at such a low cost. The medieval cure for sadness was literally poison. While some people lived in proper homes despite consuming dangerous food additives, others found themselves making more unusual dwelling choices. Not everyone in medieval times lived in a proper house or even a simple hut. In forested areas across Europe, some of the poorest people made their homes inside enormous hollowed-out trees. Oak, chestnut, and elm trees were favorites for these unusual homes. After hundreds of years of growth, these giants could reach diameters of 10 to 15 feet. Plenty of room for a small living space once hollowed out. People would carve out the decayed heartwood while leaving the living outer layers intact, creating a living structure that continued to grow around them. Extreme Home Makeover, Medieval Edition. We've upgraded you from homelessness to literally living inside a plant. These tree dwellers weren't just temporary squatters. Records from the Forest of Dean in England mention at least 17 families living in tree homes for multiple generations. One massive oak in Normandy reportedly housed a man and his family for 16 years after their farm was destroyed in a war. Medieval real estate listing: charming woodland property, natural insulation, grows in value yearly. Some woodpecker neighbors. Tree homes had surprising advantages. They were naturally camouflaged, protecting inhabitants from bandits and tax collectors. The living wood provided better insulation than many medieval huts, staying warmer in winter and cooler in summer. No rent, no landlord, just woodpeckers and hope. The forest might have provided shelter for some, but for others dealing with death, medieval culture offered another unusual occupation. When someone died in medieval Europe, their family often worried about unconfessed sins that might trap the deceased in purgatory. Enter the sin eater, one of history's strangest professions. These people literally ate the sins of the dead through a bizarre ritual that few were willing to perform. The process worked like this. A piece of bread would be placed on the chest of the corpse during the wake, absorbing the sins of the dead person. The sin eater would then enter, consume the bread, and with it, take on all those sins as their own. They'd also drink ale passed over the body and receive a small payment, usually a few coins. Job requirements: strong stomach, weak moral concerns about secondhand sin, and comfort with being the most unpopular person in town. This ritual transfer of sin was taken very seriously. Villages often had one designated sin eater, typically someone already poor and outcast. By taking on this role, they became even more isolated. Medieval career counseling: you could be a blacksmith, a baker, or eat sin-soaked bread off dead bodies. The last one has no competition, but terrible networking opportunities. The last known professional sin eater died in Shropshire, England in 1906, after cleansing over 3,000 corpses during his lifetime. Sin eaters were treated as spiritually contaminated. They couldn't enter churches and were buried in unmarked graves at crossroads rather than in church cemeteries. While sin eaters had a peculiar relationship with bread, everyday medieval folks had their own unusual dietary habits that might surprise us today. The morning beverage of choice in medieval Europe wasn't coffee or orange juice, it was beer. From kings to peasants, everyone started their day with a mug of ale, including children as young as 3 years old. This wasn't considered irresponsible parenting, it was actually the safer option. Child nutrition, medieval style, finish your beer, young Bartholomew, or no plague tales before bedtime. Water supplies in medieval towns were often dangerously contaminated. Rivers doubled as both water sources and sewage disposal systems. Beer, having been boiled during brewing and containing alcohol that killed some bacteria, was actually safer to drink than water from many sources. The beer consumed at breakfast wasn't like modern beer. Called small beer, it had a much lower alcohol content, about 0.5 to 2.5%, more like today's kombucha than a proper beer. Medieval school morning. Drink your beer, children. It's time for Latin lessons. No, you can't have water. Do you want to get sick? Monasteries brewed enormous quantities of beer, with records showing some producing over 10,000 gallons annually. Many households brewed their own supply weekly, with women typically handling this essential task. Getting tipsy at 8 a.m. Totally acceptable back then. The average medieval adult consumed about a gallon of small beer daily. It was considered a food as much as a beverage, providing significant calories from the unfermented grain. While common people drank beer for breakfast, the dining habits of the wealthy had their own surprising aspects, especially when it came to table manners. Forget what you've seen in movies about medieval kings and queens delicately cutting their food with golden knives and forks. Even the richest people in medieval Europe often ate with their bare hands, grabbing food directly from shared platters and ripping meat off bones with their fingers. Forks didn't become common in Europe until the 1600s. Before that, even kings relied on a simple knife and spoon with fingers filling in for the missing utensil. Royal dining manuals taught nobles to use the first 3 fingers of the right hand, keeping the pinky raised to avoid getting it dirty. Even at fancy feasts, you'd find dukes with greasy fingers and queens picking meat from their teeth. Court manners were more Game of Thrones than Downton Abbey. Medieval royal banquets could be incredibly messy affairs. Diners threw bones and scraps onto the floor for dogs to eat, wiped greasy hands on the tablecloth, and sometimes even on their clothes. In fact, sleeves were often designed extra wide at the end so they could double as napkins. Court records showed that King Edward I of England once ordered 12 new tablecloths after a 3-day feast because the originals were beyond salvation from grease and sauce. While eating with hands was standard, there were strict rules about which hand to use. The left hand was considered unclean because it was typically used for, bathroom duties, so eating with it could get you dirty looks or even a scolding from the royal food master. Medieval table etiquette: grab all you want with your right hand, but keep that left hand where we can see it. While royals were busy getting their fingers greasy, language was evolving in unexpected ways. Have you ever wondered why we call a man about to be married a groom? The answer takes us back to medieval stables, where the groom was the person who took care of horses. How did we get from horse caretaker to husband-to-be? Evolution is stranger than you might think. In medieval households, the groom wasn't just any stable worker. He was a trusted servant who cared for the lord's most valuable possessions, his horses. A good groom needed to be responsible, detail-oriented, and trustworthy. These were, not coincidentally, the same qualities expected in a good husband. Over time, the role of groom expanded beyond the stables. The title Groom of the Chamber described personal assistants to nobility who helped with dressing and other private matters. Love and manure were oddly connected. What does your future husband do? He's a groom. Oh, excellent with horses, is he? No, excellent husband material, though he does still smell faintly of stables. By the 1500s, the connection between grooming, caring for, a horse, and grooming, preparing oneself for marriage, had become firmly established. The original stable relationship had nothing to do with emotional maturity and everything to do with actual stables. While language evolved through stable terminology, medieval towns had their own peculiar communication systems for emergencies. Before sirens, loudspeakers, or emergency alert texts, medieval towns needed ways to warn citizens about danger. Their solution? A system of songs and chants that town watchmen would sing out to signal specific types of emergencies. Town watchmen, also called waits, patrolled the streets after dark, calling out the hours and watching for trouble. When they spotted fire, thieves, or approaching enemies, They would sing specific warning verses. Medieval emergency alert system. This is not a test. This is an actual emergency broadcast in 4-part harmony. The system was surprisingly sophisticated. In York, England, watchmen used a 3-note melody for fire, a 5-note descending scale for thieves, and a complex tune with lyrics naming the direction for approaching armies. Medieval ringtones, but make them a matter of life and death. These singing watchmen weren't chosen just for their vigilance. They needed good, loud voices that could carry across town. In larger cities like London, they were positioned at key intersections and trained to relay each other's songs, creating a musical chain of communication that could spread news across the city in minutes. The job qualification must be able to carry a tune and bad news simultaneously. Before towns had organized singing systems, medieval doctors were developing their own unusual diagnostic techniques. Medieval medicine had many strange practices, but few seem as dedicated to the job as physicians who diagnose disease by tasting their patient's urine. This wasn't just an occasional desperation move, it was standard medical practice taught in the finest medical schools of the day. Examining urine, or uroscopy, was the cornerstone of medieval medicine. Doctors carried special glass flasks called matulas, specifically designed for urine viewing. They would first examine the color, clarity, and smell, but the final test was often taste. Not the medieval job you'd want after lunch. How was work today, honey? Let's just say I'm not thirsty anymore. Medical texts described a sweet taste as a sign of diabetes, remarkably accurate, as diabetes does make urine sweet with sugar. Other tastes supposedly indicated different conditions: salty for kidney problems, bitter for liver disease. One medical text from the 1400s listed 21 different urine flavors and their corresponding diseases. Medieval medical school graduates didn't just have a degree, they had an extremely developed palate no one asked for. Elite physicians carried elaborate urine taste wheels, color-coded charts helping them match tastes to diagnoses. The original wine tasting chart, but considerably less appetizing. While doctors were busy with their unusual diagnostic methods, medieval people developed strange sleeping positions. How you sleep might seem like a matter of comfort, but in medieval times it could be a matter of life and death. Or so people believed. Many medieval Europeans slept propped up in semi-sitting positions because they thought lying flat increased your chances of dying in your sleep. The fear came from a widespread belief that the devil and his demons found it easier to steal the souls of people who slept flat on their backs. Sleeping propped up at an angle supposedly made it harder for supernatural beings to extract your soul through your mouth or nostrils. Upright napping wasn't a trend. It was survival. How did you sleep? Terribly, but at least I'm not dead or possessed, so I call that a win. This belief wasn't just peasant superstition. Medical texts from renowned physicians recommended sleeping at a 30-degree angle to keep night vapors from settling in the brain and stopping the heart. Medieval sleep advice: angels sleep on their right side, demons on their left, and smart people don't sleep at all. The practice became especially common during plague outbreaks, when people would do anything to avoid death. Town records from 1349 during the Black Death show a surge in sales of special sleeping wedges, wooden or cloth-stuffed triangles designed to prop up sleepers. The sitting position actually did provide some real medical benefits. In houses filled with smoke from hearth fires and without good ventilation, sleeping upright made breathing easier. The original sleep apnea treatment: fear of demonic soul theft. While the position you slept in could supposedly protect your soul, even the most careful medieval churchgoer faced unexpected dangers, sometimes right at the door of the church itself. When entering medieval churches, removing your shoes wasn't just respectful, it was a golden opportunity for thieves. While worshipers focused on prayers, crafty criminals lurked near church entrances, eyeing the rows of footwear left outside. Church shoe theft became such a widespread problem that many parishes had to assign specific guards just to watch over the footwear. Records from Canterbury Cathedral show that in 1386 alone, they hired 3 keepers of shoes to patrol the entrance during services. The original footlocker, minus the lock, plus a lot more theft. Court records from medieval England list over 70 cases of holy footwear theft in a single county between 1320 and 1350. Punishment was surprisingly harsh. Stealing from church property was considered sacrilege. One convicted shoe thief was sentenced to have his ear nailed to the church door. Wealthier worshippers developed creative solutions, including bringing servants specifically to guard their footwear or wearing intentionally mismatched shoes to confuse thieves. Medieval fashion hack: wear one fancy shoe, one ugly shoe. Confuse the criminals and start a trend simultaneously. While worshippers worried about their shoes, those suffering from dental problems faced their own unique medieval remedies. Got a cavity in medieval times? Before modern fillings, dentists turned to nature's sweetest solution: honey. Dental practitioners would clean out decayed parts of teeth as best they could, then pack the holes with honey or beeswax mixtures to seal them temporarily. This wasn't just a random choice. Honey contains natural antibacterial properties that actually helped fight infection. Archaeological examinations of medieval skulls show evidence of honey resin fillings in teeth that remained infection-free long after death. The original sweet tooth had nothing to do with candy cravings and everything to do with dental repair. Medieval dental manuals recommended specific types of honey for different dental problems. Clover honey was preferred for small cavities, while stronger thyme honey was used for deeper decay. One dental text from 1412 advised, "For the hollow tooth clean well the putrid matter, then fill with honey of bees that have fed on thyme, mixed with ground cloves and pepper." The pain relief was minimal, but patients reported that the sweet taste at least provides psychological comfort. Medieval dental motto: we can't stop the pain, but we can make it taste delicious. While honey helped with dental problems, town residents got their news, and sometimes unwelcome personal information. Long before newspapers, and certainly before social media, the town crier served as the medieval equivalent of breaking news, with a side of public humiliation. These official announcers didn't just share important government announcements, they also publicized your private financial troubles and social missteps. Town criers would station themselves at busy intersections and markets, ringing bells to gather crowds before shouting the day's news. Their official announcements included new laws, upcoming events, and market prices. But many towns also required criers to announce delinquent taxes, unpaid debts, and even marital problems. Medieval notification system: less "you've got mail," more "everyone's got your mail," and they're reading it aloud at the town square. Records from 15th century London show that criers were required to announce the names of tax delinquents at 3 different locations for 3 consecutive market days. In some towns, criers would stand outside a debtor's home, loudly proclaiming their financial failures to all passing neighbors. The job required specific qualifications. Criers needed powerful voices that could project over noisy crowds, good memories to recall announcements accurately, and the ability to run fast if the news they delivered angered the wrong people. Job requirements: lungs of steel, legs of a deer, and 0 sense of personal boundaries. While town criers spread news on the ground, medieval people looked to the skies for messages of a different, more ominous kind. Spotting a comet in today's world might get you a few likes on Instagram. In medieval times, it could trigger mass panic, political upheaval, and royal crisis management. Comets weren't seen as natural astronomical events, but as direct divine messages, usually angry ones. When Halley's Comet appeared in 1066, just before the Battle of Hastings and the Norman conquest of England, it cemented the idea that comets heralded disasters, particularly for royalty. For centuries afterward, the appearance of any comet sent royal courts into crisis mode. Medieval astronomical interpretation: "Oh, look, a beautiful celestial body," said absolutely no one. Instead, "Repent, the end is near." Court records show that when comets appeared, kings would order special prayers, fasting periods, and even preemptive pardons of criminals to appease divine wrath. One French king reportedly slept in the royal chapel for 2 weeks during a comet's appearance in 1402, believing proximity to the altar might protect him. The fear wasn't limited to royalty. Ordinary people often hoarded food, postponed weddings, or delayed important business deals when comets appeared. Town records show drops in market activity of up to 40% during comet appearances. Celestial objects causing market crashes long before stock exchanges existed. While comets inspired fear in the skies, romantic communication on the ground took place on some rather unusual materials. Before Hallmark cards and text messages, declaring your love required more durable materials, specifically pieces of prepared animal skin. Vellum and parchment made from calf, sheep, or goat skins were the premium writing surfaces of the medieval world, and they were particularly favored for romantic correspondence. For especially important love letters, the finest quality vellum would be selected, usually from young calves or even unborn lambs for the smoothest possible texture. Nothing says, "I love you," like writing your feelings on baby animal skin. Medieval romance, beautiful sentiments, questionable materials. What made these love letters special wasn't just their unusual material, but their longevity. Many have survived for centuries when properly stored. Archaeological finds have uncovered love letters from the 1300s with ink still perfectly legible and vellum still flexible. Wealthier suitors would commission perfumed vellum for their love letters. The preparation involved treating the skin with rose water, lavender oil, or ambergris during the final stages of production. Medieval Tinder bio enjoys long walks, good conversation, and letters that smell faintly of goat mixed with rose water. While lovers exchanged messages on animal skins, the people delivering those messages had to navigate a world without maps. Before GPS, Google Maps, or even street signs, medieval couriers navigated entirely from memory. Professional messengers had to memorize not just towns and cities, but specific landmarks, river crossings, and even which dogs along the route were likely to bite. These messengers, often called running posts, were elite employees who underwent years of training before being trusted with important communications. Records from royal courts show that apprentice messengers spent up to 3 years learning routes before carrying important messages independently. Medieval navigation system, no satellites, no maps, just a really good memory, and the constant fear of taking a wrong turn into bandit territory. Getting lost wasn't just inconvenient, it could be dangerous or even fatal, especially when carrying messages between nobles during conflicts. Court records mention several messengers executed for delivering messages late or to the wrong recipient during politically sensitive times. To help with navigation, messengers developed elaborate memory systems. They created rhyming songs that described landmarks in sequence and constructed mental memory palaces that stored route information. Medieval GPS. After the dead tree that looks like your uncle, turn left at the rock that resembles a sheep, then straight on until you smell the distinctive odor of the tannery. While messengers memorized their routes, medieval people seeking haircuts might also end up getting much more intensive procedures from the same practitioner. Need a haircut, tooth extraction, and bloodletting? In medieval times, you'd visit just one professional, the barber surgeon. These multi-talented practitioners handled everything from trimming beards to amputating limbs, often using the same tools for both. Barbers became surgeons due to a quirk of medieval religious rules. Church doctrine prohibited monks and physicians, who were often clergy, from shedding blood. Since barbers already had sharp tools and steady hands for shaving, they naturally took on surgical procedures too. Medieval one-stop shop. A little off the top, and while we're at it, let's take care of that infected leg. The iconic barber pole with its red and white stripes originated from this bloody history. The red represented blood, the white represented bandages, and the pole itself symbolized the staff patients gripped during painful procedures. Barber surgeons worked without anesthesia or antiseptics. Their medical training was primarily hands-on apprenticeship rather than formal education. Remarkably, some became quite skilled despite these limitations. Help wanted. Must be comfortable with hair clippings, teeth, blood, pus, and maintaining cheerful conversation throughout all of the above. While barber surgeons handled medical needs, those wanting to bake at home might have found themselves in trouble. That sourdough hobby you picked up during lockdown, in medieval times it might have landed you in court. Many towns and manors prohibited residents from baking bread in their homes, forcing them to use communal ovens controlled by local lords or town authorities. This system, called ban oven or oven right, wasn't just about controlling bread quality. It was a significant revenue source for lords and towns. Each loaf baked in the communal oven required payment of a fee or a portion of the bread itself. Medieval baking show, less Star Baker awards, more star defendant in bread-making criminal proceedings. Enforcement was surprisingly strict. Some towns employed oven sniffers who would walk through neighborhoods looking for the telltale aroma of illicit home baking. Court records show fines ranging from small payments to confiscation of all baking equipment for repeat offenders. The ban made practical sense in crowded wooden towns where home ovens posed serious fire risks. However, it was primarily enforced as a money-making scheme. Medieval meal prep: mix dough at home, carry it through town, trying not to look suspicious, pay the oven tax, wait in line, then carry hot bread home, all while hoping the Lord's bread inspector doesn't claim your best loaf. While bread bakers faced legal challenges, those who broke more serious laws might find themselves becoming very public examples. Long before crime deterrence involved prison sentences or community service, medieval justice relied on a more visceral approach, publicly displaying the bodies of executed criminals as warnings to the community. The practice wasn't limited to hanging bodies at crossroads, though that was common enough. Executed criminals might have their heads displayed on spikes above city gates, their quartered bodies sent to different towns, or their remains hung in iron cages called gibbets that were specially designed to preserve the body for maximum viewing time. Medieval crime prevention: less scared straight programs, more scared by what's hanging over the city gate. These displays weren't brief. Records show bodies sometimes remained on display for years. Special preservative treatments, including coating bodies in tar or boiling them in oil, were used to extend their display life. The London Bridge famously featured a constantly updated collection of traitors' heads on spikes. Court records reveal that maintaining these grisly displays was an actual paid position. Gibbet keepers were responsible for replacing ropes, repairing cages, and occasionally refreshing the preservation treatments. History's worst job application: must be comfortable with heights, have a strong stomach, and enjoy outdoor work in all weather conditions. While common criminals face public display after death, those serving royalty faced different risks, particularly when it came to mealtime. Being a royal food taster was simultaneously one of the most prestigious and perilous jobs in the medieval court. These brave or desperate individuals would sample each dish and drink before they reached the monarch, essentially serving as human poison detectors. The job required more skill than just eating quickly. Professional tasters developed techniques to detect subtle changes in food flavor that might indicate tampering. They would sample tiny portions of each dish, waiting several minutes between tastes to see if symptoms developed. Medieval job listing: exciting culinary position at royal castle. Benefits include excellent food, prestigious title, and immediate medical attention when you inevitably collapse at the dinner table. Despite the obvious risks, food taster positions were highly sought after. The role provided direct access to the monarch, comfortable living quarters, and excellent food, when it wasn't poisoned. Many tasters leveraged their position to secure better opportunities for their families. The psychological toll on monarchs is evident in their eating habits. Records show some paranoid kings would make tasters consume food, then wait up to an hour before eating themselves, resulting in perpetually cold meals. Court dinner conversation: is the king not hungry? No, he's waiting to see if the taster dies before starting his soup. While royal food tasters navigated the dangers of potential poisons at the dinner table, medieval travelers faced different kinds of dangers, some real, some imagined. When we get lost today, we blame the GPS. In medieval times, getting lost could mean sailing straight into the mouth of a giant sea serpent, at least according to their maps. Medieval cartography wasn't just about accurate geography. It was a blend of observation, mythology, religion, and wild imagination. The famous phrase, "here be dragons," or its Latin equivalent, wasn't just decorative flair. These warnings marked genuinely dangerous or unknown territories. Mapmakers filled uncharted areas with elaborate illustrations of fantastic creatures that might be lurking there. The Carta Marina, a 1539 map of Scandinavia, features dozens of sea monsters, including a giant lobster devouring a sailor and a whale mistaken for an island. Medieval GPS recalculating: turn left at the Kraken, continue straight until you see the three-headed dog, then make a U-turn if you reach the edge of the world. Estimated arrival time: Tuesday-ish, assuming you aren't devoured. Beyond monsters, medieval maps often depicted actual religious locations. Paradise or Eden typically appeared in the far east, while hell might be shown as a fiery pit at the edges of the known world. The 13th century Ebstorf map showed Christ's head, hands, and feet at the 4 cardinal directions, with Jerusalem at the center of the world. These mythological additions weren't just superstition. They served as visual memory aids in a largely illiterate society and warned travelers about potential dangers using imagery they'd understand. One medieval navigator's diary noted, "When the serpent with 7 heads appears on your chart, expect treacherous currents." The original travel advisories, less "watch out for pickpockets" and more "beware the island that's actually a giant turtle with a taste for sailor flesh." Maps were also political tools. Cartographers would exaggerate the size of their patrons' territories while shrinking rival lands. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, one of the largest surviving medieval maps, gives England a surprisingly prominent position despite its actual size. While mapmakers carefully illustrated fantastical dangers of distant lands, people preparing for the ultimate journey had their own ideas about necessary supplies for the afterlife. Death in medieval times wasn't just about saying goodbye, it was about packing for a trip. When burying their dead, medieval people included practical items they thought might be needed on the journey to the afterlife, creating some truly unusual grave contents. Food was among the most common burial items. Archaeological excavations have uncovered everything from simple bread loaves to elaborate meals in pottery containers. The type of food often reflected the deceased's status. Common folk might get a piece of bread and some ale, while nobility received wine, preserved fruits, and sometimes entire roasted birds. Medieval funeral catering, the one meal you're definitely not expected to eat, and the only time it's acceptable to be a dinner no-show. He won't mind if we take a bite, he's been dead for 3 days and hasn't touched it. Footwear was considered essential for the journey beyond. Specialized burial shoes have been found in graves across Europe, often made of thin leather or cloth and never worn in life. These corpse shoes were sometimes decorated with religious symbols or protective runes. One excavated cemetery in northern England contained over 40 pairs of these specialized burial shoes, each decorated with symbols meant to help the deceased walk safely through the afterlife. The strangest practical item, shovels. Some burials, particularly in Eastern Europe, included small digging tools. These weren't for the deceased to dig out of their graves, as some modern interpretations suggest, but rather to help dig through the earth on their spiritual journey. An excavated 12th century grave in Poland contained a miniature copper shovel with the inscription, "To part the soils between worlds." The original escape plan: "Here's a shovel, just in case the resurrection is a do-it-yourself project. We believe in you, but we also believe in practical backup plans." While people prepared their dead with provisions for the afterlife, the living tracked the passing of their own days using some rather creative timekeeping devices. Before digital watches and smartphones, medieval people tracked time with methods that were beautiful in their simplicity, if not exactly precise. Households and monasteries relied on candle clocks, water clocks, and the rhythmic tolling of church bells to structure their days. Candle clocks were among the most common household timepieces. Special candles marked with horizontal lines would burn down at a reasonably predictable rate, with each line representing approximately 1 hour. Medieval alarm clock guaranteed to wake you up exactly sometime-ish. Water clocks, or clepsydre, worked through careful regulation of dripping water. A large container with a small hole at the bottom would drip into a lower vessel marked with time indicators. Medieval time management: "Sorry I'm late, my clock evaporated." For most people, though, time was communicated through church bells. Different bell patterns signaled different times of day. The concept of precise minutes didn't much matter in everyday life. Appointments were made for general periods like mid-morning or after dinner. While time was flexible, medieval society had very strict rules about another aspect of daily life. That designer handbag you're carrying? In medieval times, it might have gotten you arrested. Sumptuary laws strictly regulated who could wear what, ensuring that clothing instantly identified social rank and preventing lower classes from dressing above their station. These laws dictated everything from fabric types and colors to the length of shoe points and width of sleeves. Purple dyes made from rare sea snails were typically reserved exclusively for royalty. Medieval fashion police didn't issue tickets, they literally took the clothes off your back. "Sir, step away from the silk and put your hands where I can see them." The penalties for violations could be severe. Records from the 14th century Florence show fines equivalent to several months' wages for wearing forbidden silks. In England, the sumptuary law of 1363 not only imposed fines but required the offensive garment to be forfeited. Enforcement created an actual fashion police. Cities like Venice employed officials called magistrates of pomps who patrolled streets looking for illegal luxury. The original "Who are you wearing?" was less a red carpet question and more a legal interrogation. While people worried about the legality of their outfits, they also sought protection from a much more serious threat. In an era of political intrigue and limited toxicology testing, medieval nobles turned to a bizarre form of poison detection: stones supposedly extracted from the heads of toads. These toadstones were believed to change color, sweat, or grow hot when in contact with poison. What people called toadstones were actually the fossilized teeth of an ancient fish called lepidotes. Their smooth, polished appearance and dome shape supported the myth that they developed inside toad heads. According to folklore, one had to place a living toad on a red cloth, whereupon it would eventually spit out the stone. According to a 15th century naturalist's guide, collecting these stones required staying awake for 3 nights watching the toad, as it would swallow the stone again if it detected human inattention. Medieval food safety. Before we eat, let me just check with this rock that came from a toad's head. Oh, it's not changing color? Dig in, everyone. Though to be fair, I got this stone from a toad of questionable reputation. These stones were so valued that they were set into rings and drinking vessels of the wealthy. An inventory from the Tower of London in 1649 listed multiple royal cups mounted with toadstones for protection. Some noble families had toadstone testing ceremonies before meals, dipping the stones into each dish while diners waited anxiously to see if they changed color. The belief in toadstones crossed class boundaries. For those who couldn't afford the real thing, counterfeit versions made from colored glass or polished stones were sold in markets. Some taverns even advertised that they tested their wine with toadstones daily, an early form of food safety marketing. The original placebo effect: I feel safer drinking from this goblet because it has a magic frog rock attached to it. It's certified organic toad, by the way. While toadstones protected the living from poison, those preparing the royal dead for public viewing had their own unusual methods of presentation. Royal funerals were elaborate affairs that sometimes included public viewing of the deceased monarch, a challenging task in the days before modern embalming. To create a more lifelike appearance for kings and queens whose bodies were displayed, morticians turned to a surprising solution: onions. Thinly sliced onions were placed in the eye sockets of deceased royalty to create the illusion of round, moist eyes rather than the sunken appearance that naturally occurs after death. The translucent quality of onion layers mimicked the look of the human cornea, especially when seen from viewing distances in dimly lit churches. Medieval royal funeral, the only time people cried because of the king, and the king also appeared to be crying because of the onions. Talk about emotional symmetry. His Majesty looks so lifelike. Yes, and oddly delicious smelling. Beyond appearance, onions served another practical purpose. Their strong smell helped mask the odor of decomposition, a significant concern when bodies might lie in state for days during elaborate funeral ceremonies. Some accounts mention onions, herbs, and flowers packed inside the royal garments for the same reason. The practice wasn't limited to royalty. Wealthy nobles sometimes received similar treatment, though with less expensive varieties of onions. One funeral director's ledger from 1422 lists different prices for viewing preparations based on the quality of onions used, with royal purple onions commanding the highest prices. Medieval mortuary upsell: for a few extra coins, we can use royal purple onions instead of common white ones. Your father would have wanted the best. The premium package also includes garlic to ward off vampires. You can never be too careful. While deceased royalty received special treatment with onion eyes, living prisoners faced much harsher conditions in some unusual incarceration locations. When medieval rulers wanted to create a particularly miserable prison, they found an ideal solution in abandoned wells. These ready-made dungeons combined the worst elements of confinement: darkness, dampness, isolation, and the psychological torture of being trapped far below ground. Well dungeons, sometimes called oubliettes, from the French word meaning to forget, were typically converted from dry or low-yielding wells that no longer served their original purpose. Prisoners would be lowered on ropes or forced down ladders that were then removed, leaving them in a cold, dark cylinder that could be up to 60 feet deep. Medieval Prison Review, 0 stars. Damp accommodations, terrible view, no room service, and the other guests are just frogs and spiders. Would not recommend it, though the echoes were fantastic for practicing my singing. Archaeological excavations of castle wells have revealed evidence of these prisons, including iron rings embedded in walls for securing chains, scratched markings from prisoners counting days, and accumulations of food waste from meals lowered from above. One well dungeon excavated at Dover Castle contained over 30 carved tally marks and the remains of a crude sleeping platform built from stones. The psychological impact was carefully calculated. Well, prisoners could typically hear activity above, people drawing water from adjacent functioning wells, marketplace sounds, or everyday castle life, while being completely isolated and forgotten. Guards could easily monitor multiple prisoners by simply looking down into the wells occasionally. Cruel and unusual punishment. We've moved your cell directly under the castle kitchen. Enjoy listening to people discuss today's feast that you'll never taste. Monday's menu sounds particularly delicious. Some well dungeons had an even more sinister design feature. They were only partially decommissioned as water sources. Records from several castles mention wet oubliettes, where prisoners stood in ankle-deep or even waist-deep water, sometimes for weeks. While prisoners suffered in dungeons, medieval scholars faced a different kind of restriction when accessing rare and valuable books. Before Amazon next-day delivery and public libraries, books were incredibly precious objects. A single volume might represent years of work by skilled scribes and illustrators using expensive materials like parchment and rare inks. The solution to protect these valuable assets while still making them accessible? Chain them to the furniture. Chained libraries were common throughout medieval Europe, especially in universities and monasteries. Heavy chains attached to book covers or bindings were secured to rods or rails along reading desks. Medieval library sign, "Books available for checkout?" That's adorable. You can check them out with your eyes from exactly where they're chained. The expensive book production justified these extreme security measures. A complete Bible might cost the equivalent of a small farm or several years' wages for an average worker. Even a modest book represented a substantial investment. Despite these precautions, book theft remained a serious problem. University court records contain numerous cases of students caught attempting to break chains or remove pages from valuable texts. Students haven't changed much. I didn't steal it. I was just borrowing it for the next 7 years. While books were secured by chains, medieval weddings were extravagant affairs that broke free from ordinary constraints. Modern couples might stress about planning a 6-hour wedding reception. Medieval nobles planned celebrations that could last longer than modern honeymoons, with festivities stretching over days or even weeks of continuous celebration. These marathon weddings weren't just about the ceremony itself, but included tournaments, hunts, feasts, pageants, and elaborate gift exchanges. For political marriages between important families, the wedding might include a formal treaty signing, military displays, and public oaths of alliance. Medieval wedding invitation: the honor of your presence is requested for approximately the next 2 weeks. Please bring your own bedroom furniture, 3 changes of formal attire, and enough servants to maintain your appearance throughout 17 scheduled feasts. The scale could be staggering. Records from a 15th century Italian noble wedding list, provisions including 30,000 loaves of bread, 300 sheep, 50 cattle, and wine measured by the barrel rather than bottle. Guests brought their own servants and sometimes entire households, with large weddings temporarily doubling the population of smaller towns. Entertainment was equally extravagant. Wedding tournaments might feature dozens of knights competing over several days. Evening entertainment included professional acrobats, musicians, jesters, and elaborate theatrical performances. One French royal wedding featured a mock naval battle staged on a flooded courtyard. Medieval wedding. DJ. And now, let's continue with day 7 of our celebration with another joust, followed by the 12th feast, before tomorrow's hunt and feast number 13. The bride and groom's first dance will take place sometime next Tuesday, weather permitting. These extended celebrations served important social and political purposes beyond mere indulgence. They allowed time for complex negotiations between families, public display of wealth and power, and formation of alliances among guests. While wedding feasts featured abundant food and drink, medieval people faced strict regulations about what they could eat. That Friday cheeseburger could have cost you more than calories in medieval times. Religious food restrictions were strictly enforced by both church and state, with serious penalties for those caught eating meat on prohibited days. The medieval Christian calendar included approximately 150 days annually when meat consumption was forbidden. All Fridays, the 40 days of Lent, and numerous saints' days and vigils. On these days, most animal products were prohibited, though fish was permitted. Conveniently, beavers and barnacle geese were officially classified as fish for these purposes. Medieval dietary loophole: it's not technically meat if we pretend this beaver is a fish. Bon appétit. And yes, according to official church rulings, this goose is definitely seafood. Don't question the theology, just pass the gravy. Enforcement varied by region, but could be surprisingly rigorous. Town records show meat inspectors who checked homes and taverns on fast days. Penalties ranged from fines to public penance. A butcher caught selling meat on prohibited days might face heavier punishment, including loss of their business license or public shaming. The restrictions created a robust market for fish and alternatives. Coastal towns saw their economies boom during Lent when demand for fish peaked. Creative cooking developed to make fasting meals more palatable. Almond milk replaced dairy, and elaborate mock meats made from fish paste or vegetable proteins attempted to satisfy meat cravings. Exceptions existed for the ill, pregnant women and travelers, but required formal permission from religious authorities. Wealthy individuals sometimes purchased special dispensations allowing meat consumption on prohibited days, essentially paying for the right to ignore the rules. Medieval menu planning. Monday is a saint's day, Tuesday is a vigil, Wednesday is Ember Day, Thursday we can have meat, Friday never, Saturday maybe depending on the moon phase, and Sunday yes unless it's Lent or Advent, or unless a visiting bishop shows up, in which case we panic and serve fish shaped like chicken. Medieval life was a fascinating blend of practicality and absurdity, proving that humans have always been wonderfully weird no matter the century. Forget everything you think you know about medieval breakfast. No cornflakes, no orange juice, and definitely no coffee. Dark, coarse bread dominated every morning meal. This wasn't fluffy white bread either. We're talking about dense, gritty loaves that could double as weapons. Most peasants washed down their bread with ale or thin beer. Yeah, beer for breakfast. Makes sense, right? Water was often contaminated, so weak beer was actually safer. Children drank it too, though theirs was watered down even more. If you were lucky, you might get some cheese or onions to jazz up your meal. But fresh fruit, that was rich people food. Apples and pears were luxury items that peasants rarely tasted. Here's the weird part. Nobody ate alone. Families crowded around a single wooden table, sharing bowls and tearing off chunks of bread with their hands. Privacy during meals was practically unheard of. The whole breakfast routine was about survival, not enjoyment. Fill your belly, get some energy, then head out to work the fields. But speaking of survival, you might wonder how these people stayed clean without modern bathrooms and soap. Personal hygiene in medieval times wasn't exactly what we'd call refreshing today. Most people bathed once a month if they were lucky. The rest of the time, well, they just dealt with it. Soap existed, but it was harsh stuff made from animal fat and wood ashes. This wasn't the gentle lavender-scented bars we know. It could scrape your skin raw if you weren't careful. Many people preferred to skip it entirely. Fleas and lice were basically roommates in every household, rich or poor. Nobles might have fancier clothes, but their hair crawled with the same bugs as everyone else's. People accepted this as normal life. Cities did have public bathhouses, though the church wasn't thrilled about them. Too much naked socializing made religious leaders nervous. These bathhouses often got shut down or heavily regulated. For teeth, people rubbed them with salt or chewed on twigs. The salt worked pretty well actually, but imagine doing that every morning. Some folks used rough cloth to scrub their teeth clean, but here's what's really wild about medieval life. The village blacksmith held more power than you'd ever expect. The village blacksmith wasn't just another craftsman. He was basically the medieval version of Tony Stark, minus the fancy tech, plus a lot more sweat and soot. These guys controlled the flow of civilization in ways most people never realized. Every horseshoe that kept travelers moving, that came from his forge. Every plow blade that fed the village, his handiwork, the weapons that protected everyone from bandits and rival lords, all hammered out on his anvil. But here's where it gets interesting. Metalwork was viewed as borderline magical by most peasants. How else could you explain turning cold, hard ore into sharp swords or delicate hinges? The blacksmith knew secrets that seemed supernatural, controlling fire, shaping iron, creating tools that could last generations. This mysterious reputation gave them serious social leverage. Villagers didn't just pay blacksmiths with coins, they owed them favors, brought them the best cuts of meat, and invited them to important decisions. Some blacksmiths became unofficial village leaders, settling disputes and organizing defense plans. Others? Well, they became the kind of people you didn't want to cross. After all, who wants to anger the guy who controls all the sharp objects? Speaking of things people feared in medieval villages, nighttime brought its own set of challenges. When darkness fell in medieval times, privacy was basically a fantasy. Most families crammed into single-room houses where everyone slept together. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes even servants shared the same space. Your bedroom was also the kitchen, dining room, and living area. Forget about comfortable mattresses. People slept on straw-stuffed sacks that quickly became home to bedbugs, fleas, and mice. The straw got moldy and smelly, but replacing it cost money most families didn't have. Wealthy folks might afford feather pillows, but even they dealt with creepy crawlers. Rich families hung curtains around their beds for some privacy. These curtains became status symbols. The fancier the fabric, the more important you were. But most people just hoped their family members were heavy sleepers. Children never had their own beds. Brothers and sisters piled together, sometimes 3 or 4 to a mattress. Body heat was actually the main heating system during cold winters. When night came, people lit rushlights, basically sticks dipped in animal fat. Candles existed, but cost too much for regular use. The flickering light barely illuminated anything, making bedtime rituals quick and practical. Speaking of practical matters, medieval people had some creative solutions for midnight bathroom emergencies that might surprise you. Imagine paying your monthly rent with a handful of black peppercorns. Sounds ridiculous. Well, in medieval times, that wasn't just possible, it actually happened. Spices weren't seasoning back then. They were currency. Black pepper was literally worth its weight in silver. A pound could buy you a sheep. Cinnamon cost more than most people earned in months. These tiny seeds and bark pieces traveled thousands of miles from Asia, surviving pirates, storms, and bandits. Every grain that made it to Europe was precious. Wealthy nobles didn't just cook with spices, they flaunted them. Hosting dinner without cinnamon or cloves, social suicide. Rich families would sprinkle expensive spices on everything, even wine, just to show off their wealth. The more exotic, the better. Meanwhile, peasants made do with whatever herbs grew in their gardens. Parsley, thyme, maybe some garlic if they were lucky. The taste gap between rich and poor wasn't just about quantity, it was about having access to flavors from distant continents. Wars were fought over nutmeg islands. Entire trade empires rose and fell chasing these aromatic treasures. But even the wealthy had to be strategic about their next meal. The medieval church didn't just control your soul, it controlled your dinner plate too. Every Christian had to follow strict fasting laws that dictated exactly when you could eat meat, dairy, or eggs. Break these rules, expect a hefty fine or public humiliation. Fish became the star of medieval kitchens during fasting periods. Wednesdays, Fridays, and the entire 40 days of Lent meant no beef, pork, or chicken. Creative cooks found loopholes, though. Beavers were classified as fish because they lived in water. Barnacle geese, also fish, apparently, because people thought they hatched from barnacles attached to driftwood. Then there were the feasts, complete opposites of fasting days. Medieval banquets were theatrical productions featuring roasted peacocks, stuffed swans, and entertainment between courses. Musicians played while jesters performed. Some feasts lasted 8 hours with dozens of courses. The wealthy showed off by serving exotic dishes like whale meat or imported wines. Poor families celebrated with whatever they could afford. Maybe a chicken or extra ale, But those fasting restrictions shaped medieval life in ways most people never realize. The constant cycle of denial and celebration created a rhythm that governed entire communities. Speaking of communities, medieval inns became fascinating social hubs where these food rules met the reality of travel. Medieval inns weren't exactly five-star establishments. When travelers stumbled through the door after a long day's journey, they got basic food and a spot in a crowded bed. And yes, you shared that bed with complete strangers. Privacy? What's that? Cities kept tight control over innkeepers, taxing them heavily and regulating their prices. Makes sense when you think about it. Travelers were easy targets for price gouging, but here's where things get weird. Some inns actually allowed animals in the guest rooms. Your horse might sleep closer to you than expected. Even in supposedly trustworthy inns, travelers kept their weapons within arm's reach. The medieval world was dangerous, and a roof over your head didn't guarantee safety. Fellow guests could be thieves, and innkeepers sometimes had questionable morals. Then there's the food situation. Most inns served whatever was cheap and available, usually bread, ale, and maybe some questionable meat stew. The beds were stuffed with straw that hadn't been changed in months. But if you think inn life was rough, wait until you hear about castle living. Those stone fortresses had their own uncomfortable surprises. Hollywood movies love showing castle life as pure luxury. But the reality was pretty miserable for most people living inside those stone walls. Sure, they looked impressive from the outside, but step inside and you'd quickly realize these weren't exactly five-star accommodations. Most castle rooms were freezing cold, smoky, and incredibly drafty. Stone walls might keep enemies out, but they also trap moisture and let icy winds whistle through every crack. Only the main hall got heated by those massive fireplaces you see in movies. Everyone else? Good luck staying warm. Then there's the bathroom situation. Castles had garderobes, basically stone seats with holes that dropped waste straight down the castle walls. No privacy, no comfort, just a cold stone seat hanging over empty air. The smell alone would knock you over. But here's what really gets me. Rodents and bats lived right in the walls. Rats scurried through corridors at night, and bats hung from the rafters. Most servants didn't even get proper sleeping quarters. They just rolled out blankets on the great hall floor. Medieval inns weren't much better, and travelers learned to expect some pretty strange sleeping arrangements. Medieval doctors had some truly bizarre ideas about healing. Barbers didn't just cut hair, they performed surgery, pulled teeth, and bled patients with rusty razors. The red and white barber pole? That's blood and bandages, not a cheerful decoration. Before treating anyone, doctors consulted star charts. They believed your illness depended on when you were born and what planets were doing that week. Mars in the wrong position? Well, that explained your headache. Leeches were the medieval equivalent of aspirin. Got a fever? Slap some blood-sucking worms on your skin. Strangely enough, this sometimes worked because it reduced blood pressure. Even broken clocks are right twice a day. Most medicines came from nearby gardens and forests. Willow bark for pain, which actually contained natural aspirin. Moldy bread on wounds, which we now know had antibiotic properties. These folk remedies weren't completely insane. But here's what's interesting. Those iconic plague masks with long beaks only appeared in the very late medieval period. Most plague doctors just wore regular clothes and hoped for the best. Speaking of protection, medieval armor tells an equally fascinating story about wealth and warfare. A knight's full suit of armor wasn't something you could pick up at the local market. We're talking about weeks of meticulous craftsmanship by skilled armorers who hammered each piece by hand. Every curve had to fit perfectly, or you'd be walking around like a tin can with serious mobility issues. The price, about the same as buying a house. Most knights inherited their armor or went into serious debt to afford it. That gleaming plate mail you see in movies represented a family's entire fortune sitting on someone's back. But here's what's interesting. Despite weighing 45 to 60 pounds, a properly fitted suit distributed weight across the entire body. Knights could actually run, climb, and even do somersaults in full armor. The real problem wasn't the weight, it was the heat. Imagine being trapped in a metal oven during a summer battle. Most soldiers never saw plate armor in their lives. They fought in simple leather jerkins, maybe a basic helmet if they were lucky. Chainmail offered a middle ground for those who could afford it, providing flexibility without breaking the bank. Speaking of breaking things, medieval law had some truly bizarre rules about what counted as criminal behavior. Being declared an outlaw wasn't just losing your good reputation, it meant you literally had zero legal protection. Anyone could kill you without facing punishment. Your property got seized, your family disowned you, and you became less than a ghost in society's eyes. But what crimes actually landed people in this nightmare? Sure, murder and treason were obvious choices, but gossip about the wrong person could destroy your life. Seriously, spreading rumors about nobles or clergy sometimes triggered outlawry declarations. Poaching a single rabbit from the Lord's forest? That's potentially a death sentence wrapped in legal paperwork. Then there were the bizarre trials. Medieval courts sometimes used trial by ordeal, where suspects grabbed red-hot iron bars or plunged their hands into boiling water. If the wounds healed cleanly after 3 days, God had declared them innocent. Burns that festered meant guilt and punishment. Even stranger were animal trials. Yes, actual court proceedings against pigs, dogs, or roosters accused of crimes. Lawyers argued cases, witnesses testified, and sentences were handed down to confused livestock. Most minor offenses resulted in fines rather than imprisonment, since jails were expensive to maintain and people needed to work. Speaking of imprisonment, medieval dungeons held secrets far darker than most people realize. Medieval dungeons weren't the stone fortresses you see in movies. Most prison cells had floors made of packed dirt or mud that turned into a soggy mess when it rained. The smell? Let's just say medieval plumbing wasn't exactly advanced. Guards often saw an opportunity to make extra money. They'd accept bribes from prisoners who wanted better food or maybe a blanket that wasn't crawling with bugs. A few coins could mean the difference between moldy bread and actual soup. Chains and wooden stocks were the go-to punishment tools. Prisoners might spend days with their hands and feet locked in place, unable to move properly. The metal would cut into their skin, leaving permanent marks. But here's what might surprise you. Torture wasn't used on everyone. It was mostly reserved for people accused of serious crimes like treason or murder. Regular thieves or troublemakers usually just got fines or public humiliation instead. The most brutal punishments, though, were saved for the worst offenders. And some of these methods were so horrifying that even hardened medieval folk would look away. The village church wasn't just for Sunday prayers. It ran everything. Weddings, funerals, market days, harvest festivals. The church calendar decided when your entire community did anything important. Miss church on Easter? Your neighbors would gossip for months. Those massive church bells weren't just pretty decorations either. When raiders approached or fires broke out, bell ringers would frantically pull those ropes to warn everyone for miles around. The sound could travel farther than any human voice, making it medieval Europe's emergency broadcast system. Here's something most people don't realize. Your local priest was basically the town's paperwork guy. Marriage certificates, birth records, land disputes, business contracts. If it needed writing, Father Thomas was your man. Most villagers couldn't read or write, so priests held incredible power just by controlling information. But whisper during Mass? That'll cost you. Churches fined people for talking, sleeping, or even arriving late. The money went straight into church coffers, and those crypts beneath the altar, they weren't just burial spots. Churches stored gold, silver, and valuable documents underground. Think of it as medieval banking, but with more holy water and considerably fewer security cameras. Speaking of religious life, monks took things even further. Monastery life revolved around prayer, but the silence between those prayers tells the real story. Monks prayed 7 times daily, starting before dawn when most people were still dreaming. The bell would clang at 4 a.m., and sleepy monks shuffled to chapel in the dark. But here's where it gets interesting. Meals were eaten in complete silence, not a single word. Instead, monks developed an entire hand signal system. Point to bread, tap your cup, gesture for more soup. It was like medieval sign language, except breaking it meant punishment. Then there's the bookmaking. Every single book was copied by hand, letter by letter. One Bible could take a monk an entire year to finish. These weren't just words either. They painted elaborate golden letters and tiny detailed pictures in the margins. Talk about job security. The monastery gardens grew more than vegetables. Monks were medieval pharmacists, growing herbs for medicines that actually worked. Willow bark for pain, lavender for sleep, garlic for infections. They knew their stuff. Wealthy monasteries owned vast lands and paid zero taxes. Not bad for a life of poverty, right? But that tax-free status created some interesting power dynamics with local lords. The Judas cradle wasn't just another medieval torture device. It was psychological warfare disguised as punishment. This pyramid-shaped nightmare stood about 3 feet tall, with its sharp point aimed upward like a deadly spear. Here's how this horror worked. Prisoners were stripped naked and slowly lowered onto the pyramid's tip using ropes and pulleys. The torturer controlled everything: how much weight pressed down, which body parts made contact first. The victim couldn't escape or shift position. What made this particularly brutal? Time. Death wasn't quick. Some prisoners lasted hours, others endured days of agony before succumbing to blood loss, infection, or shock. Guards often added weights to speed things up or removed them to prolong suffering. But the real purpose wasn't just punishment, it was fear. These devices were placed in public squares where everyone could see them. Crowds gathered not out of cruelty, but because authorities wanted witnesses. The message was clear: this could happen to you. The psychological impact spread far beyond the victim. Entire communities learned to stay in line just by walking past these instruments of terror. Speaking of terror, medieval authorities had even more creative ways to make examples of traitors and criminals. Medieval rulers weren't content with simple executions. They needed something that would make people remember for generations. Enter flaying, the practice of skinning someone alive. This wasn't your everyday punishment. Flaying was reserved for the absolute worst crimes: betraying your king, assassinating nobility, or committing treason. The process was exactly what it sounds like: slowly peeling away a person's skin while they were still breathing. Here's the truly horrifying part. Victims rarely died from the skinning itself. Most died from shock or massive blood loss hours into the ordeal. Sometimes it took an entire day. But why such extreme cruelty? Medieval justice operated on fear. Rulers believed that witnessing ultimate punishment would keep everyone else in line. Word of a flaying would spread across kingdoms, carried by terrified witnesses who'd never forget what they saw. The practice was deliberately public. Town squares, castle courtyards, anywhere crowds could gather. Executioners became skilled at keeping victims conscious as long as possible, maximizing both suffering and the psychological impact on spectators. Yet even in an age of brutal punishments, flaying stood apart as something uniquely terrible. Speaking of medieval justice, the courtroom itself held its own strange terrors. Medieval society had strict dress codes that would make today's school uniforms look relaxed. These sumptuary laws controlled what you could wear based on your social rank, and breaking them wasn't just embarrassing, it was illegal. Peasants were banned from wearing purple, silk, or fur trim. Those colors and fabrics belonged exclusively to nobility and clergy. Even specific shades of red were off limits to commoners. The wealthy wanted everyone to know their place just by looking at them. But here's the weird part. These laws were actually helpful for spotting frauds. If someone dressed above their station, people immediately knew something was fishy. A peasant wearing velvet? Definitely stolen goods, or a con artist trying to sneak into higher society. The penalties weren't jokes either. Fines, public humiliation, or even losing your fancy clothes on the spot. Guards would literally strip illegal garments right off people's backs in the town square. Then there's the practical side. These laws helped maintain the medieval economy's strict class system. Nobody could fake their way up the social ladder with a nice outfit. While clothing laws seem bizarre today, they reveal how deeply medieval medicine relied on unusual and often dangerous treatments. Medieval childhood wasn't exactly filled with Nintendo and soccer practice. Most kids started working by age 7, whether that meant helping in the fields, learning to weave, or carrying water buckets that probably weighed half as much as they did. School? That was a luxury reserved for wealthy boys who might become clerks or priests. The rest learned everything from their parents: how to milk cows, bake bread, or swing a hammer. Girls mastered spinning, cooking, and keeping house before they hit their teens. Toys were whatever kids could find or make. Sticks became swords, stones turned into marbles, and scraps of cloth became dolls. Rich children might own a wooden horse or carved figure, but most entertainment came from games like tag or simple ball kicking. Then there's the harsh reality nobody likes to discuss. Nearly half of all children died before reaching adulthood from disease, accidents, or malnutrition. Families often had many children, partly because they expected to lose several, but childhood wasn't completely grim. Even peasant kids found time to play and laugh between chores. Speaking of harsh realities, though, medieval women faced their own surprising challenges and opportunities. Medieval women weren't just sitting around waiting for their husbands to return from war. Many ran entire businesses while the men were away. Breweries, bakeries, and inns often had women as their main operators. These weren't small side hustles either. Some women controlled significant trade operations. Take widows, for example. Once their husbands died, they suddenly gained legal rights that married women couldn't touch. They could own property, sign contracts, and make business decisions. It's almost like marriage was the thing holding them back legally. Then there's the surprising world of female craftspeople. Sure, most blacksmiths were men, but records show women working metal in several towns. Female carpenters, shoemakers, and even some armorers existed. The guild system sometimes tried to keep them out, but money talks louder than rules. Noble women wielded serious power too. When kings died, their wives often became regents, essentially running entire kingdoms. Some managed vast estates with hundreds of workers. And let's not forget nuns. They weren't just praying all day. Many taught reading, ran hospitals, and created medicines that actually worked. Speaking of medicine, medieval doctors had some truly bizarre treatment methods. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it completely rewrote European society. Between 1347 and 1351, this plague wiped out somewhere between 30 to 60% of Europe's population. Entire villages simply vanished from the map, never to be rebuilt. Those eerie plague doctor masks filled with herbs, they actually believed bad smells caused disease. The beak-like masks were stuffed with aromatic substances like cloves and dried roses. Turns out they were completely wrong about how plague spread, but the costumes definitely looked terrifying. Survivor towns turned into fortresses overnight. They banned all outsiders and blocked roads for months. Some places posted guards with crossbows to shoot anyone trying to enter. Paranoia ran so deep that families abandoned their own relatives at city gates. But here's the weird part. Surviving peasants suddenly found themselves in high demand. With so many dead, labor became incredibly valuable. Serfs could demand higher wages and better treatment. Land that once supported entire families sat empty, waiting for new owners. The plague basically fast-forwarded social change by centuries. While doctors were still figuring out what worked, regular people were discovering that surviving a nightmare sometimes comes with unexpected benefits. Medieval people drank beer like we drink water today. Seriously. Your average peasant gulped down gallons of the stuff daily, and it wasn't because they loved getting tipsy at breakfast. Water was basically a death sentence back then. Rivers doubled as sewage systems, wells got contaminated by everything nasty, and boiling water for safety wasn't common knowledge yet. Beer, though? The brewing process killed off most harmful bacteria. Parents literally gave watered-down ale to their kids because it was safer than straight H2O. But here's the thing. Medieval beer was nothing like today's strong brews. Most contained barely 1 to 3% alcohol, weaker than modern light beer. You'd need to chug enormous amounts just to catch a buzz. Women dominated the brewing scene, mixing up batches in their kitchens using whatever grains they could find. Laws actually regulated beer strength to prevent public drunkenness. Makes sense, right? Can't have your entire workforce stumbling around hammered all day. The biggest problem wasn't hangovers, though. It was spoilage. Without refrigeration, beer went bad within days, sometimes hours. Speaking of food going bad, medieval nobles had their own wild solutions for preserving fancy meals. Medieval nobles didn't just collect gold and land, they hoarded exotic animals like trophies, turning their estates into medieval zoos that would make today's pet owners jealous. Falcons were the ultimate status symbol. Kings literally passed laws about who could own which birds. A peregrine falcon? That belonged to earls only. Peasants caught with the wrong bird faced serious punishment. These weren't just pets either. They were hunting machines worth more than most people's houses. But falcons were just the beginning. Wealthy lords imported monkeys from distant lands, kept peacocks strutting around their gardens, and bred tiny lapdogs that cost fortunes to maintain. Some nobles even owned bears, kept chained in courtyards for entertainment. The really wealthy? Their pets had servants, actual human beings whose job was feeding and grooming animals all day. Imagine explaining that career choice to your parents. Then there's the breeding obsession. Lords competed over who had the most exotic bloodlines, not just for themselves, but for their animals too. A well-bred hunting hawk could launch political alliances between families. Speaking of things that require daily maintenance, medieval teeth tell their own fascinating story about status and survival. Medieval people actually had better teeth than you might expect. Without sugar flooding their diets, tooth decay happened far less often than today. Their biggest dental enemy? Gritty bread that wore down enamel like sandpaper. When teeth did need cleaning, people got creative. Twigs worked as toothbrushes. Birch and oak were popular choices. Others used rough cloth dipped in salt or herbal mixtures. Sage, mint, and rosemary made breath fresher while scrubbing away food bits. But here's where things got brutal. Got a toothache? The local barber surgeon would yank it out with iron pliers. No numbing, no gentle technique. Just grip, twist, and pull while you screamed into a leather strap. Rotten teeth meant serious trouble. Infections could kill, and they often did. Some desperate souls tried burning out the nerve with hot irons. Others chewed cloves or drank themselves senseless with ale before extractions. The wealthy sometimes replaced missing teeth with carved wood or animal teeth tied in place. Uncomfortable and gross, but better than gaping holes. While teeth lasted longer back then, losing one still hurt like hell. Speaking of pain, medieval fairs offered their own mix of pleasure and peril. Medieval fairs weren't just weekend markets. They were massive economic events that transformed entire regions for weeks at a time. Picture thousands of merchants traveling hundreds of miles with wagons full of silk from China, pepper from India, and glass so fine it looked like captured sunlight. These weren't your typical town gatherings either. The biggest fairs, like those in Champagne, France, operated under special laws that protected foreign traders. Murder a visiting merchant? That was treated worse than killing a local. Cheat someone with false weights? You'd face penalties that could bankrupt your family for generations. But here's what made these fairs truly wild. They were part business convention, part carnival. Acrobats performed between fabric stalls. Musicians played while spice dealers haggled over cinnamon prices. Jesters mocked the crowd while goldsmiths displayed rings worth more than most people's houses. The really clever part? Fair organizers created temporary currencies and credit systems that let merchants trade without hauling chests of actual coins everywhere. Pretty advanced for people we think barely understood economics, right? Of course, all this international commerce needed protection, and medieval warfare had some seriously creative tricks for keeping enemies away. Medieval soldiers didn't just swing swords and hope for the best. They had tricks that would make modern special forces jealous. Boiling oil gets all the attention, but defenders actually preferred sand. Why? Hot sand stuck to armor and worked its way into every gap, burning skin for hours. Lime powder blinded attackers instantly when thrown from castle walls. Some fortresses kept barrels of tar ready to pour on siege ladders. Imagine trying to climb while covered in sticky, burning goo. Archers weren't just pointing and shooting either. They waxed their arrow feathers with beeswax for perfect flight patterns. Smart knights positioned polished metal mirrors on castle walls, using them like periscopes to spot enemy movements without exposing themselves. Then there were murder holes, innocent-sounding name for something terrifying. These openings in castle ceilings let defenders drop rocks, arrows, or boiling liquids directly onto invaders below. Attackers never knew when death might rain down from above. Siege towers looked impressive, rolling toward walls, but defenders had counters. They'd shoot flaming arrows or use long poles to push the towers away from walls. Speaking of clever defenses, some castles had hidden sally ports, secret doors for surprise attacks on unsuspecting besiegers. Getting caught for petty crimes in medieval times meant facing the pillory, and trust me, this wasn't just standing around looking embarrassed. The pillory was basically medieval Twitter, but instead of angry comments, you got rotten vegetables hurled at your face. Picture this contraption. Wooden boards with holes for your head and hands locking you in place for hours. You couldn't sit, couldn't duck, couldn't even wipe your nose. The whole town turned into your personal nightmare audience. Theft, spreading gossip, cheating customers, or selling watery ale. Straight to the pillory you went. And people didn't just walk by politely. They brought their worst produce specifically to throw at you. Moldy bread, spoiled eggs, even human waste sometimes joined the party. The pain wasn't just from flying garbage either. Standing bent over for hours made your back scream and your legs go numb. Some folks passed out from the strain, but the wooden restraints kept them upright anyway. Here's the weird part. Sometimes crowds got so worked up that they turned violent, beating prisoners to death. What started as public shaming could escalate into full riots, making even simple punishments deadly affairs. But medieval justice had even more creative ways to make people suffer. Medieval dental work makes modern root canals look like spa treatments. When your tooth went bad, the local barber surgeon grabbed iron pliers and yanked it out while you screamed. No Novocaine, no gentle extraction, just raw strength and prayer. The real horror wasn't just the pain. Rotten teeth killed people regularly through deadly infections that spread to the jaw and brain. One bad molar could literally end your life in weeks. Replacement teeth? Well, wealthy folks sometimes got wooden pegs or carved animal teeth hammered into their gums. Most people just lived with gaps and chewed on one side of their mouth forever. Mouthwash existed, sort of. People gargled with vinegar or wine mixed with herbs, which probably burned like fire on open wounds. The lucky ones had access to cloves, which actually numbed pain temporarily. When agony became unbearable, medieval dentists had two solutions: opium if you were rich, or getting drunk if you weren't. Some patients passed out from alcohol before the pliers even touched their teeth. Speaking of daily pain, nothing compared to what happened when entire towns ran out of their most basic necessity. When harvests failed, medieval towns turned into powder kegs. Bad weather meant grain rotted in fields or never grew at all. Bread prices didn't just rise, they exploded overnight. A loaf that cost a penny suddenly demanded 3 or 4. Hungry people don't stay calm for long. Crowds gathered outside bakeries, shouting and demanding answers. Bakers became public enemies, accused of hoarding grain or charging unfair prices. Some got dragged from their shops and beaten by angry mobs who thought they were getting rich off starvation. But here's the thing. Most bakers weren't villains. They bought grain from merchants who jacked up prices first. Local laws forced bakers to sell bread at fixed rates, even when their costs skyrocketed. Many went broke trying to feed their towns. Authorities tried controlling the chaos with soldiers and price controls. Sometimes they worked. Other times, bread riots spread like wildfire through entire regions. People smashed windows, looted grain stores, and fought in the streets over crusts. These food riots revealed how fragile medieval life really was. But the daily dangers of cooking that bread, that's where things got even more interesting. Medieval kitchens were basically controlled chaos with a side of third-degree burns. Most homes cooked over open wood fires that filled rooms with thick, choking smoke. No fancy exhaust fans here, just windows you hoped would catch a breeze. Here's the kicker. Most people didn't even have their own ovens. Towns shared one massive public oven, usually owned by the lord or church. You'd prepare your bread or pie at home, then carry it through muddy streets to wait in line. The baker would slide your food into the communal oven using a long wooden paddle, and you'd better hope nobody mixed up whose dinner was whose. Professional cooks developed an almost supernatural ability to judge oven temperature. They'd stick their hand inside and count how long they could keep it there before the pain became unbearable. 2 seconds, perfect for bread. 1 second, too hot, wait it out. Wealthy households sometimes had small indoor stoves, mainly used for brewing medicinal potions or heating wine. But even noble cooks sported permanent burn marks on their arms, battle scars from wrestling with medieval fire. Speaking of medical treatments, those burn remedies used some truly bizarre ingredients that might surprise you. Medieval doctors had some truly bizarre ingredients in their medicine cabinets. We're talking about remedies that included honey mixed with pig's fat, crushed pearls, and even ground emeralds for the wealthy patients. The logic? Expensive meant effective, right? But here's where it gets really gross. Animal dung was a popular wound treatment. Doctors genuinely believed that fresh manure could help heal cuts and infections. Sometimes they weren't entirely wrong. Certain animal droppings did contain helpful bacteria, though they had no clue why it worked. Then there's the accidentally brilliant stuff. Moldy bread was often applied to infected wounds, and it actually helped prevent further infection. Medieval healers had stumbled onto what we now know as penicillin centuries before Fleming made it famous. Doctors wrote their bizarre recipes on expensive parchment scrolls, treating these concoctions like precious secrets. A typical remedy might call for crushed beetle shells, wine, and a pinch of gold dust. The wealthier you were, the the more exotic your medicine became. Yet for all their strange ingredients, herbal remedies remained the most trusted treatments. Speaking of trust, medieval legal systems had their own peculiar ways of determining truth. Medieval nobles had way too much time on their hands. What did they do with it? They created fake courts to judge love affairs. These weren't real legal proceedings. Rich ladies would sit as judges while men presented cases about romance, heartbreak, and whether someone's girlfriend was being unreasonable. Seriously, knights would argue about proper courting techniques like lawyers debating property disputes. The most famous was Eleanor of Aquitaine's court in France. She listened to dramatic complaints about unrequited love and issue rulings. Sir Geoffrey must write 3 poems to prove his devotion. Lady Margaret owes her suitor 1 dance at the next feast. Winners got prizes, poems, or just bragging rights. But here's the weird part. These mock courts actually influenced real marriage disputes. Nobles started using courtly love rules in actual legal cases. The whole thing shaped medieval literature too. Those romantic knight stories, they came from these silly court games. Then there were the traveling minstrels who spread these love court stories across Europe, turning local gossip into epic tales. Speaking of entertainment that captivated medieval audiences, nothing matched the spectacle of magnificent war horses thundering across battlefields. Medieval war horses were basically 4-legged sports cars that cost more than most people's homes. A fully trained destrier could buy you an entire village, and that's not an exaggeration. These weren't your average farm animals either. They were bred for battle, trained to kick and bite enemies, and strong enough to carry a knight in full armor without breaking a sweat. But here's the thing most people get wrong about medieval times. Not everyone rode horses. Actually, most people walked everywhere. Horses were for the wealthy, and even then you needed special permission to own certain breeds. Royal bloodlines weren't just for people. Then there's the practical side nobody talks about. Horses needed custom shoes for different weather. Snowshoes, mud shoes, even spiked versions for ice. Blacksmiths made fortunes just keeping horses walking properly. Horse racing became huge at festivals too. Peasants would bet their week's wages on which noble's horse would win. The excitement was infectious, and winners became local celebrities overnight. Speaking of entertainment, medieval courts had another fascinating group of performers who could mock kings without losing their heads. Court jesters weren't just entertainers dancing around for laughs. They held one of the strangest privileges in medieval society: the right to mock anyone, including kings, without losing their heads. These professional fools could insult nobles, criticize royal decisions, and even make jokes about the king's appearance or policies. Why? Because their words were considered harmless folly. Smart rulers actually valued this feedback wrapped in humor. It was the only honest criticism they'd ever hear. Many jesters were dwarves or people with disabilities, seen as touched by God and therefore speaking divine truth through comedy. But don't think they were helpless. Some were incredibly clever spies for their royal patrons, gathering secrets while everyone dismissed them as harmless entertainers. Then there's the fascinating tradition of Fool's Day, where servants could boss their masters around for 24 hours. Tables turned completely. Lords served meals while their servants gave orders and cracked jokes at their expense. Some jesters even wrote early theatrical works and developed comedy routines that influenced entertainment for centuries. These weren't simple clowns. They were sharp-witted performers navigating dangerous political waters. Speaking of strange medieval beliefs, people carried some truly bizarre superstitions and charms for protection. Medieval people believed in some truly bizarre superstitions that would make modern conspiracy theorists look reasonable. Hanging garlic and iron above doorways wasn't just about cooking or decoration. It was serious magical protection against demons and evil spirits lurking outside. Graveyard dirt was like medieval insurance. People actually carried pouches of cemetery soil, believing it would shield them from curses and bad luck. Makes you wonder how many pockets smelled like death, right? Black cats got the worst deal of all. These poor animals were literally hunted down because folks thought they were demons in disguise or witches' servants. Crossing paths with one meant instant bad fortune was heading your way. Then there's the crossroads, fear. These intersections weren't just confusing for travelers, they were considered supernatural danger zones after dark. Evil spirits supposedly gathered there to make deals and trap souls. Lucky charms were everywhere. Animal bones carved into shapes, wooden amulets, even rabbit feet dangled from belts and necks. Everyone carried something magical for protection. But while people clutched their bone charms and avoided black cats, they still needed to travel those dangerous medieval roads and bridges, which presented very real, non-magical threats. Building a bridge in medieval times wasn't just engineering, it was an act of faith. Most bridges were made of wood and collapsed regularly, taking travelers down with them. Stone bridges, those were massive projects that could take decades to complete. The famous London Bridge took over 30 years to build and was considered one of the world's wonders. But here's the twist. Most people never crossed fancy stone bridges. They used rickety wooden planks, ferries, or just waded through rivers hoping not to drown. Roads were even worse nightmares. What we called roads were basically muddy tracks carved by countless feet and wagon wheels. After rain, they turned into swamps. Bandits loved these conditions because travelers moved slowly and couldn't escape quickly. Then there's the brilliant medieval solution to funding bridges: toll gates. Want to cross? Pay up. Some bridges had houses and shops built right on them, turning crossings into mini-towns. Bridge keepers became wealthy from collecting fees, while travelers cursed every coin they had to drop. But successful bridge builders, they were treated like saints. Some literally became saints after death. Speaking of medieval saints and their strange powers, creating a medieval book wasn't like hitting print on your computer. Every single page started with an animal's skin, usually a calf or sheep. The poor creature's hide got scraped, stretched, and treated until it became smooth parchment. One book could require dozens of animals. Then came the real work. Monks hunched over desks for months, sometimes years, copying each letter by hand. Their fingers cramped, their backs ached, and one tiny mistake meant starting the entire page over. No whiteout existed back then. The fancy books got illuminated letters, those gorgeous gold leaf capitals that practically glowed on the page. Artists mixed real gold with egg whites and painted each decoration with brushes made from squirrel hair. Talk about expensive artwork. Here's the crazy part. Finished books were so valuable they got chained to library tables like prisoners. Literally chained. Steal a book and you'd face serious punishment because that single volume represented months of labor and a small fortune in materials. Most people never owned a book in their entire lives. Reading was mainly for priests and nobles who had the time and money for such luxuries. But speaking of luxuries, wait until you hear about medieval festivals where everything got turned completely upside down. The Festival of Fools turned medieval society completely upside down for one wild day each year. Peasants dressed as bishops and delivered mock sermons while actual clergy sat in the pews like regular folk. Makes sense, right? Well, not really, but that was the whole point. Picture the town, drunk, stumbling around in stolen robes, blessing people with ale instead of holy water. Meanwhile, servants paraded through streets wearing their master's finest clothes, shouting orders at anyone who'd listen. The entire social hierarchy became a complete joke. But here's the weird part. Church leaders actually supported this madness. They believed letting people blow off steam prevented real rebellions. Smart thinking, considering how much anger peasants bottled up the other 364 days. Then there were the parades. Animal masks, drunken singing, and dancing that would make your grandmother faint. People acted like absolute lunatics, knowing tomorrow they'd return to bowing and scraping before their betters. Sometimes the celebrations got too rowdy and ended in actual violence. Speaking of entertainment, medieval folks had other ways to pass time when they weren't pretending to be bishops. Music in medieval times wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. Minstrels wandered from village to village, carrying news, gossip, and stories wrapped in melodies. No newspapers meant these traveling musicians were your CNN, Fox News, and Entertainment Tonight all rolled into one. The instruments were simpler but surprisingly effective. Harps, fiddles, and drums dominated most gatherings. Peasants couldn't afford fancy lutes, so they made do with wooden flutes or simple drums fashioned from animal skins. The wealthy, they had entire orchestras for dinner parties. Dancing happened everywhere. Village squares turned into dance floors during festivals, with people spinning barefoot on dirt and stones. No fancy ballrooms needed. The moves were energetic and communal. Everyone joined in, from toddlers to grandparents. But here's the clever part. Drum beats weren't just for fun. Farmers used rhythmic music to coordinate harvest work. Teams would thresh grain or pick crops to specific beats, making backbreaking labor more bearable and efficient. Even the church got musical. Gregorian chants filled cathedrals, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that left peasants awestruck. Speaking of awe-inspiring medieval experiences, wait until you hear about the surprising world of public bathhouses. Public bathhouses were surprisingly common in medieval cities. Men and women had separate hours, though some places got creative with dividers down the middle. These weren't just about getting clean either. Bathhouses became social hubs where people gossiped, made business deals, and showed off their latest tunics. But here's where it gets interesting. Traveling merchants brought bathing customs from all over Europe and beyond. Italian traders introduced perfumed oils. German visitors preferred scalding hot water that would make you jump. Eastern European customs included birch branch scrubbing that left people looking like they'd wrestled with a tree. Then the plague hit, and everything changed. People started blaming bad air and open pores for spreading disease. Suddenly, those relaxing communal baths seemed dangerous. Many bathhouses closed permanently, while others, well, let's just say they found new business models. Some turned into gambling dens or brothels, which didn't help their reputation with the church. Others became private clubs for wealthy merchants only. The weird part? This fear of bathing stuck around for centuries after the plague ended. Speaking of strange medieval fears, knights had their own bizarre set of rules they lived by. When most people think of knights, they picture shining armor and perfect honor. Reality was messier. Knights swore elaborate oaths to protect the weak and serve God, but many treated peasants like dirt. These vows sounded impressive in castle halls, yet plenty of knights spent their time pillaging villages or picking fights with neighbors. Tournaments became the safer alternative to actual war. Knights could test their combat skills without dying, though broken bones were common. The crowds loved it. Think medieval WWE with real weapons and way more blood. Then there's the armor situation. Each knight decorated their gear with personal symbols, animals, or family colors. A lion might represent courage, while a boar showed stubbornness. Some chose dolphins or roses, which seems less intimidating but made sense to them. Breaking a knightly oath meant social death. Exile, disgrace, loss of lands, everything gone. The shame followed families for generations. Many knights traveled for crusades and holy wars, convinced they were doing God's work. Others stayed home, managing estates and settling local disputes. But beneath all that ceremony and pageantry, knights remained professional warriors in a violent world where survival often trumped honor. Those bizarre plague doctor outfits weren't just Halloween costumes gone wrong. They were medieval hazmat suits designed by pure fear and questionable science. The famous beak wasn't for show. Doctors stuffed it with aromatic herbs, dried flowers, and spices, believing pleasant smells would block the bad air that supposedly caused plague. Rosemary, thyme, and lavender became their medical arsenal against death itself. The longer the beak, the more protection they thought they had. Their entire body disappeared under heavy leather or waxed fabric, every inch covered. Thick gloves, long coats, and wide-brimmed hats completed the terrifying ensemble. Those creepy glass goggles, they protected eyes from evil vapors floating around infected patients. But here's the twisted part. The costume actually worked, just not how they thought. All that coverage accidentally created a barrier against fleas carrying the real plague bacteria. Medieval doctors stumbled into proper protective equipment while chasing completely wrong theories about disease. The outfit backfired socially, though. Children screamed when they saw these walking nightmares approaching. Parents hid. Even desperate patients sometimes refused treatment from these bird-like figures of death. Speaking of medieval misconceptions, doctors weren't the only ones using codes and secrets to protect themselves. Medieval spies had to get creative when it came to hiding their messages. While we think of invisible ink as some modern spy movie trick, they were already using lemon juice centuries ago. Heat up the paper and boom, secret text appears like magic. But that wasn't their only trick. Latin became the perfect code language since most people couldn't read it anyway. Even if someone intercepted your message, they'd need education to crack it. Smart move, right? Then there's the really clever stuff. Spies would hide coded messages inside innocent-looking poems or religious texts. A love letter might actually contain military secrets. Each third word could spell out troop movements. The poem about spring flowers actually detailed escape routes. Wax seals weren't just for show either. Hollow them out, stuff a tiny message inside, seal it back up. Guards would check the obvious places, but never think to break open that fancy wax stamp. Some operatives used body signals too. A certain way of adjusting your cloak meant danger ahead. Scratching your ear could signal mission complete. Speaking of secret communications, medieval merchants had their own network of hidden messages that helped build massive trading empires across continents. Medieval merchants didn't just sell things locally, they built massive trading networks that stretched across continents, connecting Europe to Asia and Africa in ways that would make modern logistics companies jealous. Venice and Genoa became Europe's biggest trading powerhouses. Their ships carried everything from English wool to Chinese silk, making these Italian city-states incredibly wealthy. Venetian merchants were so rich they practically owned entire trade routes. But here's what's wild. A single trading voyage could take months or even years. Ships loaded with European goods would sail to Constantinople, trade for Asian spices and silk, then return home. If they made it back alive, the profits were enormous. Black pepper bought in India could sell for 20 times its price in London. These trading fairs weren't just about business either. They introduced Europeans to new foods, fabrics, and ideas. Imagine tasting sugar for the first time or seeing porcelain so delicate it seemed magical. The risks were insane, though. Pirates, storms, and wars could destroy entire fortunes overnight, yet merchants kept sailing because the rewards were worth dying for. Speaking of death, medieval public executions were their own kind of spectacle. Public executions weren't just about punishment, they were the ultimate medieval entertainment. Crowds traveled for miles to watch someone meet their end, treating it like a festival complete with food vendors and street performers. The whole thing followed a twisted script. Condemned prisoners got paraded through town on a cart, sometimes forced to wear signs listing their crimes. Executioners became local celebrities, often wearing masks or hoods to add drama. Some even had signature techniques that drew bigger audiences. But here's the weird part. Musicians actually played at scaffolds. Drums rolled before the final moment, and sometimes entire bands performed between multiple executions. It was like a concert, except someone died at the end. Executions served as brutal teaching moments too. Local leaders used them to remind everyone what happened when you broke the law. Stealing bread? Here's what awaits. Adultery? Watch this. The fear factor was the whole point. Executioners got paid surprisingly well for their grim work, but they lived as social outcasts. Nobody wanted to grab drinks with the guy who chopped off heads for a living. Speaking of social outcasts, there was another group that faced even stranger treatment. Witch trials weren't just medieval hysteria, they were deadly serious business with bizarre scientific methods. The water test was particularly twisted. Accused witches got tied up and thrown into ponds. If they floated, they were guilty witches who rejected holy water. If they sank and drowned, well, at least they died innocent. Then there were needle tests. Investigators poked suspected witches all over, searching for spots that didn't bleed or feel pain. These devil's marks supposedly proved supernatural connections. Professional witch finders made good money traveling town to town with their special needles. Most accused witches weren't cackling hags brewing potions. They were often widows, healers, or women who'd angered neighbors. Got into a property dispute? Your accuser might claim you cursed their cow. New herbal remedies? Clearly, you were practicing dark magic. The church sometimes stepped in to protect accused women from angry mobs. Ironically, religious authorities often showed more mercy than regular townspeople. Trials peaked in the late medieval period, spreading fear across Europe. But speaking of fashion trends that spread across medieval Europe, some clothing choices were just as extreme as witch hunting and far more ridiculous. Medieval fashionistas took things to extremes that would make today's runway models look conservative. Pointed shoes called poulain grew so absurdly long that some reached over a foot in length. Walking became a genuine challenge. Imagine trying to climb stairs when your toes extend into next week. Laws eventually had to limit shoe length because people kept tripping over their own feet. Hats told everyone exactly where you stood in society. Poor folks wore simple hoods that could double as blankets. The wealthy, they strutted around with feathered contraptions so tall They barely fit through doorways. Some hats required their own servants just to keep them balanced. Then there's the button revolution. These little fasteners first appeared on rich people's clothes as pure decoration. They didn't even work. Actual functional buttons took decades to catch on. Meanwhile, lace became the ultimate status symbol, with nobles spending fortunes on intricate patterns that took months to create. Winter furs were worn year-round, regardless of weather. Nothing said, "I'm important," like sweating through a fox coat in July. Fashion trends spread slowly from France and Italy, taking years to reach remote villages. But fashion wasn't just about looking good. Some medieval clothing choices bordered on dangerous territory. Getting fresh, clean water in medieval times, that was basically winning the lottery. Most people had about as much chance of finding pure water as they did of spotting a unicorn. Wells were the main water source, but here's the thing. They were hand-dug by people who had zero understanding of geology. These wells collapsed constantly, sometimes taking entire families down with them. And even when they worked, the water tasted like dirt, mixed with whatever dead animal happened to fall in last week. Rivers seemed like a better option until you realized they flowed right past everyone's waste pits. People literally dumped their chamber pots upstream from where others collected drinking water. Brilliant planning, right? The smart ones boiled their water with herbs like mint or sage. This actually helped kill some of the nasty stuff floating around, though they had no idea why. Towns with money built stone walls around their wells to keep animals and debris out. But bad water still caused massive disease outbreaks that wiped out entire neighborhoods. Clean water was so precious that some people spent their whole day just finding it. Speaking of precious things medieval people obsessed over, wait until you hear what they did for entertainment. Medieval people weren't just sitting around waiting for entertainment to be invented. They had games that would make modern sports fans jealous. Chess wasn't some fancy noble hobby. Everyone played it. Peasants carved crude pieces from wood scraps, while lords commissioned elaborate ivory sets. But here's the kicker. Medieval chess had different rules. The queen could barely move, making games drag on for hours. Dice games were absolutely everywhere. Taverns, markets, even church steps after service. People bet everything. Coins, food, clothes off their backs. Some dice were loaded with mercury or weighted with lead. Cheating was an art form. Then there were the brutal sports. Jousting tournaments drew crowds like medieval Super Bowls. Knights charged at each other with 12-foot lances, aiming to knock opponents off horses traveling at full speed. Death was common, but crowds loved it. Football existed, but it was more like organized warfare. Entire villages played against each other across fields, through streams, even into neighboring towns. Rules? What rules? Broken bones were expected. Wrestling matches happened at every fair. Winners got actual prizes, a pig, a barrel of ale, or a year's worth of bread. But burial customs reveal just how dangerous medieval life really was. Death in medieval times wasn't the sanitized affair we know today. When someone died, the whole village knew about it immediately. Bodies were washed and wrapped at home by family members, not professional undertakers. Burial happened fast, really fast. Without embalming, you had maybe a day or two before things got unpleasant. Most graves were dug only 3 or 4 feet deep because digging was backbreaking work with primitive tools. This shallow depth meant older bones often got mixed up with new burials. Grave diggers would just toss the old skulls and femurs to the side. Then there's the coin tradition. Families placed copper or silver coins on the deceased's eyes, supposedly to pay the ferryman in the afterlife. Poor families used pottery shards instead. Funeral processions were loud, dramatic affairs. Professional mourners wailed and tore their clothes for effect. Musicians played somber tunes while everyone wore black robes or dark cloth tied around their arms. Rich merchants and nobles built elaborate family tombs, but most people ended up in unmarked graves in the churchyard. Space was so limited that bodies were often stacked on top of each other. But medieval people had some fascinating beliefs about what happened after death. Medieval people were absolutely convinced that dragons soared through distant skies and unicorns pranced in hidden forests. Well, why wouldn't they be? Their maps literally had "Here be monsters" scrawled across unexplored territories, complete with drawings of sea serpents and winged beasts. But here's the weird part. These weren't just silly bedtime stories. Educated nobles and scholars genuinely believed these creatures existed somewhere beyond their known world. They'd trade unicorn horns for massive fortunes, not knowing they were buying narwhal tusks from clever merchants. Then there were the local legends that kept entire villages awake at night. Every creaking forest had its resident troll. Every unexplained illness, obviously caused by a witch's curse or an angry forest spirit. People would swear they'd seen giants walking through morning mist or heard the wails of banshees before someone died. Supernatural omens explained everything medieval folks couldn't understand. Strange lights in the sky meant war was coming. A two-headed calf, bad harvest ahead. These stories weren't entertainment, they were medieval science, helping people make sense of a world full of mysteries they couldn't possibly explain any other way. The line between reality and legend was beautifully, terrifyingly blurred. You've been lied to about medieval times your entire life. While you were taught they were dirty and backwards, they were actually pioneering technologies we can't replicate today. But the most shocking truth, one medieval invention was so dangerous, the church banned it forever. Back in 1518, the city of Strasbourg witnessed something that would make today's flash mobs look like child's play. A woman named Frau Trophäa stepped into the street and began dancing. Nothing unusual there, right? Well, she didn't stop. For days. Within a week, dozens joined her. Not by choice, mind you. They simply couldn't help themselves. Their feet moved against their will, spinning and leaping until they collapsed from exhaustion. The authorities, bless their medieval hearts, thought hiring musicians would help, because clearly what uncontrollable dancers needed was a better beat. By the end of the month, around 400 people were trapped in this bizarre dance marathon. Some danced themselves to death. Literally. Heart attacks, strokes, sheer exhaustion. Makes your worst wedding reception look pretty tame, doesn't it? Modern scientists believe it was mass hysteria brought on by extreme stress and ergot poisoning from contaminated bread. The people of Strasbourg were dealing with famine, disease, and social upheaval. Their minds simply snapped under pressure. The dancing plague wasn't unique to Strasbourg either. Similar outbreaks popped up across Europe throughout the medieval period. Entire communities would lose control of their bodies, dancing until they dropped. But if you think medieval justice was limited to punishing humans, wait until you hear what they did to animals who broke the law. But here's where medieval justice gets truly bizarre. Animals weren't just witnesses to crimes, they were the actual defendants. Picture this. A pig sits in a medieval courtroom, complete with a judge, jury, and even a defense attorney. Sounds like a comedy sketch, right? Well, it happened regularly throughout Europe. In 1386, a pig was literally put on trial for biting a child. The pig lost. Badly. These weren't just random village pranks either. We're talking full legal proceedings with all the pomp and circumstance of human trials. Locusts faced charges for crop destruction. Rats got summoned for theft. One particularly memorable case involved an entire colony of termites being excommunicated from the church for property damage. The legal system treated these cases with dead serious professionalism. Animals received proper representation, actual lawyers who argued their cases with straight faces. Makes you wonder what those law school classes were like, doesn't it? Some defendants even won their cases. Occasionally, animals were simply exiled instead of executed. Imagine being the guy whose job was to escort a cow out of town and make sure it never returned. This wasn't about justice as we understand it today. Medieval. Courts believed morality extended beyond humans to all of creation. Every living thing was accountable to God's law. But speaking of peculiar medieval medical practices, wait until you hear about their approach to healing through starvation. Medieval doctors had some pretty wild ideas about health, but none quite as bizarre as their obsession with water fasting. These physicians genuinely believed that avoiding food and drinking only water could cure everything from headaches to demonic possession. Well, at least they were half right about the water part. Picture this. You've got a splitting headache, and instead of reaching for willow bark tea, your local doctor prescribes 7 days of nothing but water. The theory? Your body was supposedly clogged with evil humors that only pure fasting could flush out. Monks took this even further, combining spiritual discipline with what they called medical necessity. They'd fast for weeks before major religious festivals, believing it purified both soul and stomach. Here's where it gets really weird, though. Medieval physicians actually created detailed fasting schedules based on your social class. Nobles got 3-day gentle fasts with blessed spring water, while peasants were told to tough it out for weeks with whatever water they could find. The irony? Modern science shows short-term fasting can have some health benefits, but these medieval marathons usually led to malnutrition and made people sicker than when they started. But if you think water fasting was extreme, wait until you hear what medieval surgeons did when patients had severe head injuries or mental illness. Here's something that'll make your skin crawl. Medieval doctors had a favorite cure for everything from headaches to mental illness. Drilling holes in people's skulls. Yeah, you heard that right. They called it trepanation, and it was about as pleasant as it sounds. The theory? Evil spirits or bad blood were trapped inside your head, causing all sorts of problems. So naturally, the solution was to grab a drill and make a convenient exit hole. Makes perfect sense, right? But here's the kicker. People actually survived this barbaric procedure. Archaeologists have found skulls with clear signs of bone regrowth around these holes, proving patients lived long enough for their heads to start healing. That's either incredibly lucky or surprisingly skilled surgery for an era when soap was optional. The tools they used would make a horror movie director jealous. We're talking sharpened flint, seashells, and crude metal instruments. No anesthesia, no sterile environment, just pure medieval grit and a prayer that you wouldn't bleed out on the operating table. Well, at least they were creative with their medical disasters. Speaking of creative medical practices, wait until you hear what medieval doctors could determine just by tasting your pee. Trust me, you'll never complain about modern lab tests again. Medieval doctors had a pretty strange way of diagnosing you. Forget blood tests or x-rays, they just ask for a cup of your pee and call it a day. Actually, they took urine analysis so seriously that it became the backbone of medieval medicine. These physicians would examine your urine's color, smell it, and here's the kicker, they'd actually taste it. Yeah, you heard that right. Your doctor would literally sip your pee to figure out what was wrong with you. Talk about dedication to the job. They had elaborate urine charts showing dozens of different colors, each supposedly indicating a specific disease or condition. The darker your urine, the more concerned they'd get. Clear meant you were healthy, cloudy suggested fever, and reddish tones? Well, that meant trouble was brewing inside. Some doctors claimed they could diagnose everything from kidney stones to pregnancy just by examining urine samples. Now, before you laugh too hard, this wasn't completely ridiculous. They were actually onto something. Modern medicine still uses urine tests today. But medieval doctors took it way too far, believing they could diagnose mental illness and predict death from a single sample. The weirdest part? Some physicians never even bothered examining the actual patient. Just bring them a jar of pee and they'd write you a prescription. But speaking of weird medieval treatments, wait until you hear what they made people wear. Laws from medieval times didn't just control crime. They controlled what you wore to dinner. Sumptuary laws were the dress codes from hell, dictating exactly who could wear what. Think your workplace has strict rules? Try living in an era where wearing the wrong color could land you in jail. These laws weren't suggestions. They were serious business. A peasant caught strutting around in silk-faced hefty fines, sometimes worse. The idea was simple. Keep everyone in their lane through fashion policing. Purple was basically off-limits to commoners. Why? Because purple dye cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Makes sense, right? Only royalty and high nobility could afford such extravagance, so naturally they wanted to keep it exclusive. But here's the kicker. Even if you somehow scraped together enough money for fancy fabric, the law still said no. Wealth alone wasn't enough. You needed the right bloodline or title to match your wardrobe. Bright colors, fine furs, jewelry with actual precious stones, all reserved for the upper crust. Think of it like medieval copyright protection, except instead of protecting ideas, they were protecting social status through clothing. Breaking these rules wasn't just embarrassing, it was expensive and sometimes dangerous. Well, speaking of dangerous medieval practices, wait until you hear about how they made their ink. Medieval scribes had a secret weapon that made their manuscripts survive longer than most modern books. Their ink wasn't just any mixture, it was crafted from oak tree gall. Nuts, those weird little bumps you've probably walked past without a second thought. Here's the kicker. When wasps lay eggs in oak branches, the tree fights back by forming these crusty growths. Medieval ink makers would collect these galls, crush them up, and mix them with iron sulfate and gum arabic. The result? Ink so chemically stable it could outlast empires. But wait, it gets weirder. Some recipes called for wine as an ingredient. Not because scribes were tipsy on the job, though that would explain some of those wonky illuminated letters. The alcohol actually helped preserve the mixture and made it flow better across parchment. The whole process was like medieval chemistry class. Artisans guarded their recipes like state secrets, passing them down through generations. One wrong ratio and your precious manuscript would fade faster than a politician's campaign promise. Today's fountain pen enthusiasts still recreate these ancient formulas. Makes you wonder what our descendants will think of our ballpoint pens and laser printers, right? Speaking of medieval medical practices that seem bizarre by today's standards, let me tell you about their approach to bloodletting. Medieval doctors had a slimy solution for just about everything: leeches. These blood-sucking worms were the aspirin of the Middle Ages, prescribed for headaches, fevers, and even broken hearts. Well, maybe not broken hearts, but you get the idea. The theory was simple. People believed your body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much blood? Time to drain some out. And what better way than letting a bunch of hungry leeches have at it? Doctors kept these little vampires in special jars like a medieval medicine cabinet that could bite back. Some physicians became so attached to their leeches, they named them. Imagine calling your doctor and hearing, "Sorry, Gertrude is having lunch on another patient right now." But here's the kicker. Leech farms were actually a booming business. Entrepreneurs bred millions of these creatures specifically for medical use. Think Amazon warehouses, but squishier and more disgusting. The weirdest part? Sometimes it actually worked. Not because of the humor-balancing nonsense, but because leeches produce natural blood thinners. Modern surgeons still use them today for certain procedures, especially when reattaching fingers or ears. Of course, medieval patients didn't know about blood thinners. They just knew that after losing a pint of blood, they felt different. Speaking of feeling different, wait until you hear how they settled legal disputes. When someone wronged you in medieval times, forget calling a lawyer. You could literally fight for justice. Trial by combat was a completely legal way to settle disputes, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Picture this: 2 guys arguing over who owns a cow. Instead of presenting evidence, they grab swords and beat the hell out of each other until one gives up or dies. The winner? Obviously, telling the truth according to God's will. Makes perfect sense, right? Well, not really. But medieval people believed divine intervention would guide the righteous to victory. It's like saying whoever wins at arm wrestling must be morally superior. The logic was bulletproof if you didn't think about it too hard. Here's where it gets interesting, though. Women could participate, but they weren't expected to duke it out themselves. Smart move. Instead, they could hire a champion to fight on their behalf. Basically, medieval lawyers, except they settled cases with battle axes instead of paperwork. Some trials even used symbolic weapons like wooden clubs or leather shields. Less bloody, more theatrical. Think WWE, but with actual legal consequences. The craziest part? This system lasted for centuries because people genuinely believed might made right. Physical strength equaled moral truth. Even nobles used it to resolve inheritance disputes. But speaking of strange medieval beliefs about divine intervention, medieval folks were absolutely obsessed with holy relics. We're talking about supposed body parts of saints, pieces of the cross, even vials of Jesus' blood. Sound sketchy? Well, it gets weirder. These relics weren't just sitting in dusty corners. They were rock stars of the medieval world. People would travel thousands of miles just to touch a saint's finger bone. Think of it like medieval Instagram influencers, except instead of followers, they had pilgrims. Canterbury Cathedral claimed to have Thomas Becket's skull fragments. The shrine was so popular, it basically funded the entire cathedral's construction. That's some serious saint money right there. But here's where it gets hilarious. There were supposedly enough pieces of the true cross scattered across Europe to build Noah's Ark twice over. Either Jesus was crucified on a forest, or someone was running a medieval counterfeit operation. The competition between churches was fierce. Venice literally stole St. Mark's body from Alexandria. They smuggled it out in a barrel of pork fat because Muslim guards wouldn't search anything containing pig products. Clever, right? Some relics were absolutely ridiculous. Multiple churches claimed to have Jesus' foreskin. Yes, you heard that correctly. The medieval relic game had zero chill. Well, speaking of things worth more than their weight in gold, medieval spices created trade wars that make today's oil conflicts look like playground squabbles. Picture walking into a medieval marketplace where black pepper costs more than your house. That's not an exaggeration. A pound of saffron could literally buy you a horse, and cloves were so precious that people used them as currency. These weren't just fancy seasonings, they were liquid gold flowing through trade routes that connected Europe to the far corners of Asia. Merchants risked everything crossing deserts and dodging pirates for a handful of, nutmeg. Why? Because back home, nobles would pay astronomical prices to make their bland porridge taste like something other than wet cardboard. The spice trade was basically the medieval version of cryptocurrency, except way more dangerous. Entire wars were fought over pepper routes. Venice became ridiculously wealthy just by controlling the spice highway from the east. And here's the kicker. Some landlords accepted peppercorns as rent payments. Seriously, your monthly rent could be a small bag of what we now sprinkle on our eggs without thinking twice. But the real madness? Most Europeans had never even seen these spices growing. They had wild theories about cinnamon trees guarded by giant birds or pepper that grew in snake-infested valleys. The mystery only drove prices higher. These precious seasonings didn't just flavor food, they literally shaped the world economy. Speaking of shaping things, wait until you hear what medieval cooks did to make their dinner guests scream. Medieval banquets weren't just about eating, they were full-blown theater productions. Picture this. You're sitting at a noble feast, expecting maybe some bread and meat, when suddenly a massive pie gets wheeled out. But here's the kicker. It's not filled with fruit or meat. It's stuffed with live birds that burst out when the crust is cut, flapping around the dining hall like some demented magic show. Well, that's just the appetizer for weirdness. The main course might be a roasted swan, meticulously redressed in its own feathers to look like it's still alive, or a peacock posed with its magnificent tail spread wide, because apparently medieval chefs had way too much time on their hands. These weren't just meals, they were edible art installations that would make today's food bloggers weep with envy. And the weird part is, these elaborate displays weren't even the strangest thing on the table. Almond milk was everywhere, not because they were lactose intolerant, but because regular milk spoiled faster than a teenager's mood. They used it in everything from sauces to desserts, making it the medieval equivalent of our modern oat milk obsession. The wealthy literally ate their status symbols, turning dinner into a competitive sport of who could serve the most outrageous dish. But if you think medieval dining was extravagant, wait until you hear about their tax system. Here's something that'll make your modern tax complaints seem pretty tame. Back in medieval times, there was this thing called Peter's pence. And no, it wasn't pocket change. This was basically Europe's first international tax system. Every household in England had to cough up a penny each year to send straight to the Pope in Rome. One measly penny might not sound like much, but when you're barely scraping by as a medieval peasant, that penny could buy you a loaf of bread. The kicker? They called it voluntary. Yeah, right. About as voluntary as your boss asking you to work overtime on Friday night. The church made it crystal clear that paying up was your Christian duty, and nobody wanted to mess with eternal damnation over a penny. What's wild is how organized this whole operation was. They had collection networks spanning thousands of miles, all funneling money from muddy English villages to fancy Roman palaces. Think of it as medieval crowdfunding, except you didn't get a thank you mug. The tax supposedly bought spiritual protection from St. Peter himself. Medieval folks were essentially paying for heavenly insurance premiums, and just like modern insurance, people grumbled about it, but paid anyway. But here's where things get really strange. Sometimes the church demanded payment in ways that would make your skin crawl. Picture being a medieval woman who talked back to her husband or gossiped too much with the neighbors. Well, you'd get acquainted with one of history's most terrifying fashion accessories, the scold's bridle. This contraption looked like something from a medieval nightmare. An iron cage wrapped around your entire head, complete with a metal bit that went straight into your mouth. The bit had spikes or rough edges that would cut your tongue if you tried to speak. Lovely, right? But here's where it gets really twisted. They didn't just lock you up at home with this thing. Oh no, that would be too private. Instead, your husband or the local authorities would parade you through town wearing it. Think of it as medieval social media shaming, except way more brutal, and you couldn't delete the posts later. The whole point was public humiliation. Everyone would see you clanking through the streets, head trapped in iron, unable to defend yourself or explain your side of the story. Makes today's Twitter arguments look pretty tame by comparison. What's particularly disturbing is that men decided what counted as disorderly behavior. Disagreeing with your husband, scolds bridle, complaining about anything. Iron mask time. Then there's the fact that some of these contraptions had bells attached, ensuring maximum embarrassment as you walked. But speaking of medieval justice getting creative with punishment, picture a medieval lord facing a crucial battle decision, staring intensely into a crystal sphere. Not checking his phone for weather updates, but genuinely believing this glass ball held the secrets of tomorrow. Crystal ball divination wasn't just parlor trick entertainment back then, it was serious business. Knights consulted scryers before charging into combat. Merchants gazed into crystals before investing in trade routes. Even peasants saved up coins to peer into these mystical orbs when facing life-changing choices. The practice, called scrying, had roots stretching back to ancient civilizations, but medieval folks took it to another level entirely. Professional fortune tellers traveled from castle to castle, carrying their precious crystal spheres like modern consultants, with briefcases. Here's the weird part. These weren't cheap carnival attractions. Quality crystal balls cost more than most people earned in months. The clearest specimens came from specific mines, and master craftsmen spent weeks polishing each sphere to perfection. Lords paid handsomely for crystal consultations before major decisions. Makes you wonder what they saw in there, right? Probably about as accurate as checking your horoscope before buying lottery tickets. But honestly, when you're living in an era without weather forecasts, medical scans, or stock market predictions, staring into a crystal ball probably felt like having supernatural Wi-Fi. Speaking of medieval medical practices, wait until you hear what they thought about basic hygiene. Medieval people had some truly bizarre ideas about staying clean. Actually, let me rephrase that. They had ideas about not staying clean. Most folks back then thought bathing was basically asking for trouble. Here's the kicker. They believed washing your body stripped away essential oils that protected you from disease. Talk about backwards thinking. Instead of hopping in a tub, people layered on clothes like they were preparing for Arctic exploration. The idea was that your undergarments would soak up all the sweat and grime, keeping your skin safely dirty. But wait, it gets weirder. Some medieval physicians warned that hot baths opened your pores, making you vulnerable to deadly vapors floating around. Others claimed frequent washing made you weak and effeminate. Imagine explaining that logic to your spouse today. The irony? This fear of cleanliness actually caused the very diseases they were trying to avoid. Poor sanitation led to rampant epidemics that swept through towns like wildfire. Average lifespans were shorter, not despite their hygiene theories, but because of them. And here's my personal favorite bit of medieval madness. Certain warriors believed bathing in specific enchanted waters could make them immune to arrows. Right, because magic water beats proper armor every time. Then there's the absolutely wild world of medieval justice, where even animals weren't safe from courtroom drama. Picture medieval Europe's version of a clearance sale, except instead of discounted electronics, the church was selling forgiveness. Indulgences became Christianity's strangest business model. Pay money, get your sins wiped clean. Brilliant marketing, really. These weren't just for the wealthy either. Peasants scraped together coins while kings dropped fortunes, all believing they could literally purchase their way into heaven. The Pope's sales team traveled across Europe like medieval Amazon Prime, delivering spiritual relief right to your doorstep. But here's where it gets bonkers. You didn't even need cash. Some indulgences were earned through good deeds, pilgrimages, or even participating in the Crusades. Think of it as an early rewards program, except the points were measured. In years off purgatory, instead of airline miles, the whole system grew so ridiculous that people started buying indulgences for sins they hadn't committed yet. Planning to lie to your wife next Tuesday? There's an indulgence for that. It was like spiritual insurance with zero deductible. Of course, this holy hustle eventually backfired spectacularly. Martin Luther took one look at this religious marketplace and basically said, "Are you kidding me?" His famous 95 Theses were essentially a very angry Yelp review that sparked the Protestant Reformation. Well, speaking of people who could get away with almost anything, let's talk about medieval court jesters. Court jesters weren't just goofy entertainers juggling balls for laughs. These guys had one of the most dangerous jobs in medieval times, and probably the most important one too. Think about it this way. If you wanted to tell your boss he's making terrible decisions, you'd probably get fired. But jesters, they could literally mock the king to his face and get paid for it. Wild, right? Here's the thing though. They weren't just cracking jokes. Jesters served as unofficial political advisors, using humor to deliver harsh truths that nobody else dared speak. When a king's policies were failing miserably, the jester could point it out through clever wordplay and satirical performances. The really brilliant part was their costume. Those colorful, patched outfits with jingling bells weren't just for show. They were like a diplomatic immunity pass. The moment you saw that motley clothing, you knew this person could say absolutely anything without facing execution. And get this, some of the most famous jesters were actually women. Mathurin, for instance, entertained French royalty and got away with roasting nobles on the regular. She probably had better job security than most cabinet ministers. But here's where things get really interesting. The jester's role went way beyond entertainment because medieval medicine had some absolutely bizarre practices that make today's treatments look downright reasonable. Medieval alchemists weren't just crazy old men mixing weird stuff in basements. Well, some were, but hear me out. These guys were basically the first real scientists, just with terrible marketing. Picture this. While everyone else was worried about not dying from the plague, alchemists were busy trying to turn lead into gold. Sounds nuts, right? But here's the kicker. They accidentally invented half the chemistry we use today. Talk about failing upward. The famous philosopher's stone wasn't just some Harry Potter nonsense. Medieval alchemists genuinely believed this magical rock could transform any metal into pure gold. Imagine the medieval equivalent of getting rich quick schemes. Instead of cryptocurrency, they had mysterious stones. But the weird part is how close they actually got to real science. While hunting for impossible gold-making recipes, they discovered distillation techniques that we still use today. They figured out how to make better medicines, stronger acids, and even improve perfumes. Not bad for a bunch of guys chasing fairy tales. The 13th century was peak alchemy time. These dudes wrote instruction manuals that mixed actual chemical processes with complete mystical gibberish. One paragraph would explain legitimate laboratory procedures. The next would discuss communicating with spirits. Many alchemists went completely broke chasing their golden dreams, but their obsession with transformation and purification led to discoveries that changed everything. Sometimes the best inventions come from the worst business plans. Speaking of medieval inventions with staying power, you won't believe what else they created accidentally. Cats in medieval times weren't just cute companions lounging around. They were working professionals with serious job security. Monasteries and churches specifically hired these furry employees for one critical task: keeping rats away from precious manuscripts and food supplies. Think about it like this. Your grandmother's church probably has a donation box, but medieval churches had donation cats. These weren't strays wandering in for scraps. Monks deliberately brought cats into their communities because rats were destroying everything from grain stores to hand-copied books worth more than most people's annual income. The relationship was purely business at first. Cats got food and shelter. Churches got pest control that actually worked. But something funny happened over time. These working cats became so valued that some monasteries started blessing them during religious ceremonies. Talk about employee benefits. What makes this even more interesting? Cats were simultaneously loved and feared in medieval society. Outside church walls, they faced suspicion for their supposed connections to witchcraft, but inside religious buildings, they were practically sacred guardians protecting God's work. Some monasteries kept detailed records of their cats, noting which ones were best mousers and even giving them names. One abbey recorded spending more on cat food than candles in a particularly bad rat year. This practical partnership laid the groundwork for our modern relationship with house cats. But medieval people had other strange medical practices that make cat employment seem perfectly reasonable. Medieval alchemists didn't just chase gold and immortality elixirs. They moonlighted as the world's first fashion designers, creating dyes that literally transformed society's appearance. These wizard chemists discovered that certain colors required the same mystical processes they used for transmuting metals. Tyrian purple, more valuable than actual gold. They crushed thousands of tiny sea snails to create just 1 gram of this legendary dye. Makes today's designer handbag prices look reasonable, doesn't it? But here's where it gets weird. Alchemists believed specific colors held magical properties. Red dyes made from cinnabar weren't just pretty, they supposedly transferred the power of Mercury to whoever wore them. Blue from lapis lazuli connected you to the heavens. Yellow from saffron brought wisdom and divine favor. The process was pure medieval chemistry. They'd grind precious stones, boil exotic insects, and mix in secret ingredients that sound like spell components. Some recipes called for aged wine, others demanded morning dew collected during specific moon phases. Well, the economic impact was staggering. Entire trade routes developed around these magical pigments. Kings bankrupted treasuries for the right shade of royal blue. Common folk saved for years just to afford a single colored thread. The funny thing? Modern synthetic dyes killed this mystical industry overnight, though I bet those alchemists would be fascinated by today's glow-in-the-dark fabrics. Speaking of medieval obsessions that seem downright bizarre today, wait until you hear about their vampire problem. Picture this. Your neighbor dies, but 3 days later, someone swears they saw him wandering around at midnight. What do? Well, if you lived in medieval Europe, you'd grab a wooden stake and get to work. The fear of vampires wasn't just some gothic fantasy back then, it was dead serious, literally. Entire villages would dig up corpses if they suspected someone had returned from the grave. They'd look for telltale signs like bodies that hadn't decomposed properly or blood around the mouth. Makes you wonder what they'd think of modern embalming, right? But here's where it gets really wild. These weren't random superstitions. Many historians believe vampire scares were actually medieval Europe's way of explaining disease outbreaks. When plague hit a village and bodies started piling up, people needed something to blame. A bloodthirsty undead neighbor? Perfect scapegoat. The methods they used were brutal. Staking through the heart was just the appetizer. Some regions preferred decapitation, stuffing garlic in the mouth, or even burning the entire corpse. Talk about overkill. What's fascinating is how these dark beliefs shaped everything we know about vampire lore today. From Dracula to modern horror movies, it all traces back to terrified medieval peasants with shovels and stakes. Speaking of terrified peasants, wait until you hear about their battles with giant snails. Here's something that'll make you question medieval artists' sanity. Flip through any monastery manuscript from the 13th or 14th centuries, and you'll find knights locked in epic battles. But they're not fighting dragons or rival armies. They're fighting snails. That's right, garden variety, slow-moving, slimy snails. These weren't random doodles either. Over 20% of illuminated manuscripts featured these bizarre snail versus knight showdowns. We're talking about some of the most expensive, carefully crafted books of the era, and scribes consistently chose to draw armored warriors taking on mollusks. The symbolism? Well, that's where it gets interesting. Some scholars think the snail represented the slow, grinding persistence of common folk against the nobility. Others believe it symbolized patience overcoming brute force, like your grandmother always beating you at chess despite your fancy strategies. But here's the kicker. These weren't just tiny margin sketches. Artists devoted serious real estate to these scenes. Knights wielding massive swords, snails rearing up on their, well, whatever snails rear up on. The detail was extraordinary. Maybe medieval artists had the same sense of humor we do about internet cat videos, or maybe they understood something about life's absurdities that we've forgotten. Either way, they clearly knew that sometimes the smallest opponent poses the biggest challenge. Speaking of unexpected medieval challenges, wait until you hear what people thought the stars could tell them. Medieval folks took stargazing seriously. We're talking about consulting the night sky for everything from when to plant turnips to whether Tuesday was a good day to get married. And honestly, their astrologers had more job security than most Wall Street analysts today. Kings wouldn't make a single major decision without checking their star charts first. Your royal astrologer basically held the same position as today's chief of staff, except with way cooler hats and significantly more crystal balls. These weren't just guys making wild guesses either. They spent years studying planetary movements and celestial patterns. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval astrology wasn't the horoscope nonsense you see in newspapers. These scholars genuinely believed the stars controlled human health, weather patterns, and political outcomes. Doctors would literally refuse to perform surgery unless Mercury was in the right position. Makes you wonder how many appendix operations got postponed because of a cranky constellation. The really wild part? Some of their astronomical calculations were surprisingly accurate. While they were wrong about stars controlling personality traits, their mathematical work on planetary orbits laid groundwork for actual science. Not bad for guys who thought Saturn caused melancholy. Then there's the fact that medieval people used different remedies for ailments, some involving ingredients that would make your skin crawl. Medieval people genuinely believed mandrake roots would let out blood-curdling screams when pulled from the ground. And we're talking about grown adults here, not kids afraid of monsters under the bed. These weird little roots, which honestly do look disturbingly human-shaped, were considered the holy grail of medieval medicine. Apothecaries would pay ridiculous amounts for them. Think of paying your monthly rent for a single carrot, and you're getting close. But here's where it gets really wild. People were so convinced about the deadly screams that they developed elaborate extraction methods. They'd tie the root to a dog, plug their ears with wax, and have the poor animal yank it out while they ran away. Talk about medieval OSHA violations. The irony? These roots were actually poisonous. While folks were jumping through hoops to harvest them safely, they were basically collecting nature's own little poison packages. Medieval doctors used them in potions anyway because apparently logic took a holiday back then. Some entrepreneurial types even carved regular roots into human shapes and sold them as genuine mandrakes to gullible customers. Medieval snake oil salesmen, if you will. Well, speaking of medieval medicine gone wrong, wait until you hear about the secret language builders used to construct those massive cathedrals. Medieval builders had a secret language that would make modern construction crews jealous. They carved mysterious symbols directly into stone blocks, geometric shapes, letters, and bizarre marks that looked like ancient graffiti but served a crucial purpose. These weren't random doodles from bored masons. Each symbol was a precise instruction manual carved in stone. A simple triangle might indicate where a specific archpiece belonged, while crossed lines showed alignment points. Think of it as medieval GPS for cathedral construction, except way more permanent than your phone's battery life. Here's the brilliant part. Most workers couldn't read or write, but they could memorize these visual codes perfectly. A mason from France could walk onto an English building site and immediately understand the stone language. It was like medieval IKEA instructions, but actually useful. The symbols also revealed which guild crafted each piece. Master masons signed their work with personal marks, creating an accountability system that would shame modern contractors. Some stones carry over a dozen different symbols, proof that medieval teamwork required serious coordination. But why all the secrecy? Well, cathedral construction took decades, sometimes centuries. Workers died, moved on, or forgot crucial details. These carved instructions ensured continuity across generations of builders. The weirdest part? Some symbols remain completely mysterious even today. Medieval masons took their secrets seriously. Speaking of medieval mysteries, wait until you hear about their bizarre burial customs. While most medieval Europeans buried their dead in the ground, there was this absolutely wild practice happening thousands of miles away that would make your stomach churn. Sky burials. Yeah, you heard that right. Instead of digging graves, some cultures just left bodies out in the open for the birds. Literally? Picture this. When someone died, their family would carry the body up to a high plateau or mountaintop. Then they'd just leave it there. Vultures, ravens, and other scavengers would do the rest. The whole thing was over in a matter of days. Now, before you start gagging, there was actually some serious logic behind this bizarre ritual. These communities believed the soul had already moved on, so why waste perfectly good meat? Plus, in places like Tibet, where the ground was frozen solid half the year, digging graves was about as practical as trying to plant tomatoes in concrete. But here's the really fascinating part. This wasn't considered disrespectful at all. Quite the opposite. Feeding the birds was seen as a final act of generosity. One last good deed before heading to whatever came next. The whole process symbolized the transition from physical to spiritual existence. Makes you think differently about our own burial customs, doesn't it? Speaking of unusual medieval customs, wait until you hear about the iron collar of shame. Picture getting caught gossiping about your neighbor's terrible cooking, and suddenly you're wearing a metal contraption that makes you look like a medieval robot. Well, that's exactly what happened with the iron collar of shame. This delightful piece of medieval fashion wasn't designed for comfort. The iron collar fit snugly around someone's neck, often weighing several pounds, and came with helpful inscriptions like gossip or scold, just in case anyone missed the point. Think of it as the world's worst name tag. What's fascinating is how this punishment targeted behavior we'd barely notice today. Complaining about your husband snoring, collar time, spreading rumors about the baker's love life. You guessed it. The collar made sure everyone in town knew exactly what you'd done wrong. But here's the twisted logic that actually worked. Public humiliation was often more effective than physical punishment. People feared social ostracism more than a beating. The collar turned the entire community into judge and jury, creating a walking advertisement for proper behavior. The worst part? Some collars came with bells. Imagine trying to sneak anywhere while jingling like a one-person marching band. It's like medieval authorities invented the ultimate anxiety dream. Speaking of medieval justice getting creative with consequences, wait until you hear about their approach to making light itself. Picture medieval nights without electricity. No light switches, no flashlights, just the flickering dance of candlelight keeping the darkness at bay. But here's what most people don't realize. Making candles was basically medieval rocket science. These weren't your modern store-bought candles. Candle makers were true artists, crafting everything from cheap tallow candles that smelled like a barnyard to luxurious beeswax masterpieces that burned clean and bright. The wealthy didn't just want light, they wanted status symbols that glowed. Here's where it gets wild. Rich families would commission candles with their family crests carved right into the wax. Think of it as medieval Instagram, showing off your wealth one flickering flame at a time. Some artisans spent weeks creating elaborate designs that would melt away in hours. Talk about expensive temporary art. The really fancy ones, pure beeswax, hand-sculpted with intricate patterns. They cost more than most people's monthly wages. Meanwhile, peasants made do with tallow candles that produced more smoke than a faulty barbecue and smelled about as appetizing. Monasteries became candle-making powerhouses, churning out thousands for their endless prayer sessions. They needed reliable light that wouldn't sputter out during midnight masses. But even these master candle crafters couldn't predict the explosive entertainment coming next. Medieval lords didn't just want impressive castle defenses, they wanted spectacle. Enter medieval fireworks, the original blockbuster entertainment that made modern 4th of July celebrations look like birthday candles. Picture this. Gunpowder, originally imported from China for warfare, quickly found its way into tournament festivities. Well, who doesn't love a good explosion? Medieval pyrotechnicians mixed saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal to create dazzling displays that could light up entire castle courtyards. The crowd went wild. But here's where things got interesting. These weren't your safe, regulated fireworks displays. Medieval firemasters basically winged it every single time. No safety protocols, no fire department standing by, just pure medieval chaos with a fuse attached. Makes sense, right? The real kicker? Castle defenders discovered they could integrate these explosive displays into their actual defense systems. Nothing says, "Stay away from my castle," quite like surprise fireworks shooting from the ramparts. Talk about psychological warfare. Some celebrations ended in spectacular disasters. Records show entire wooden viewing platforms going up in flames, guests diving for cover, and more than a few singed eyebrows. Yet people kept coming back for more. The thrill was apparently worth the risk of becoming human toast. Then there's the sheer unpredictability that made each display a genuine gamble with physics. So we've covered some bizarre medieval practices, but here's where things get absolutely ridiculous. Picture a courtroom. The defendant stands accused of murder. The judge bangs his gavel. And the accused? A pig. I'm not joking. Medieval courts regularly put animals on trial for crimes against humans. Pigs were the usual suspects, but locusts, rats, and even roosters faced legal proceedings. These weren't symbolic gestures either. They were full trials with prosecutors, evidence, and verdicts. In 1497, a sow in France was tried for murdering a 5-year-old. The court appointed legal counsel for the pig. Think your lawyer bills are high now? The defense argued the pig acted without malicious intent. The prosecution demanded justice for the grieving family. After deliberation, the pig was found guilty and publicly hanged. But wait, it gets weirder. Some animals even won their cases. A group of weevils destroying crops in 1509 successfully argued through their lawyer that they deserved access to food. The court actually set aside land for them to eat freely. Why did this happen? Medieval people believed animals could sin and needed to face divine justice. Plus, public trials reinforced social order. If even pigs faced consequences, humans certainly would too. These trials lasted until the 18th century. Makes you wonder what other strange legal practices existed, doesn't it? Well, speaking of unusual medieval justice, the Maiden's Mill wasn't your typical workplace punishment. This twisted medieval institution forced women into grueling labor for offenses that would barely raise an eyebrow today. Gossiping too much? Off to the mill. Speaking back to your husband? Time to grind grain until your hands bled. These weren't just regular mills either. They were designed as public spectacles where entire communities could watch unruly women learn their place. The irony? Many of these facilities were more productive than regular mills because desperation makes for motivated workers. But here's where it gets really bizarre. Some women actually volunteered for mill duty to escape worse punishments or abusive households. Talk about choosing the devil you know. The work was backbreaking, sure, but at least you got fed regularly and had a roof over your head. The whole system was basically medieval society's way of saying, we'll break your spirit through exhaustion. Guards would rotate shifts to ensure no woman got a moment's rest during daylight hours. Makes today's workplace complaints seem pretty trivial, doesn't it? What made this even more twisted was how it became a twisted form of entertainment for locals. Families would bring picnics to watch the show. Well, if you think forced labor mills were bad, wait until you hear about the church's strangest invention. Ever wonder why the Catholic Church would deliberately hire someone to argue against making someone a saint? Well, they literally created a job called the devil's advocate for exactly that purpose. This wasn't some Hollywood drama. The church invented this position to make sure they weren't accidentally canonizing frauds or lunatics. The devil's advocate's job was to dig up dirt, poke holes in miracles, and basically be the ultimate skeptic. Think of it as medieval fact-checking, but with eternal consequences. Here's the kicker. They were required to argue against the candidate, even if they personally believed the person deserved sainthood. Talk about professional dedication. It's like being forced to criticize your grandmother's cooking when you secretly love it. The process was brutal. Out of roughly 500 cases where someone was proposed for sainthood, fewer than 100 actually made it through. That's a worse success rate than most dating apps. The devil's advocate would challenge everything, from alleged miracles to the candidate's character flaws. What makes this brilliant is how it prevented the church from making embarrassing mistakes. No organization wants to canonize someone only to discover later they were secretly running a medieval gambling ring. But here's something even stranger about medieval justice. It wasn't just about arguing against saints. Sometimes they put creatures on trial that couldn't even speak for themselves. Medieval knights didn't just ride horses, they rode four-legged life insurance policies with the intelligence of a seeing-eye dog. These weren't your average barn animals trotting around with hay breath. War horses received training that would put modern service animals to shame. They learned to strike enemies with their hooves, bite on command, and even retrieve their fallen riders' weapons. Some could navigate battlefields blindfolded, relying purely on sound and their riders' weight shifts. Talk about GPS before satellites existed. But here's where it gets expensive. Maintaining a proper war horse cost more than feeding a family of 6 for a year. Knights needed backup horses, pack horses, and specialized breeding stock. One destrier, that's fancy talk for a knight's main battle horse, could cost as much as a modern luxury car. These animals became living symbols of social status. The bigger and more magnificent your horse, the more respect you commanded. Knights without proper steeds were basically showing up to a board meeting in flip-flops. The bond between knight and horse often lasted decades. Some horses learned their riders' combat patterns so well they'd anticipate moves before commands were given. When a knight died, his horse sometimes refused to accept a new rider. Well, speaking of medieval survival tactics, let me tell you about some creative youngsters who developed their own ingenious methods. Picture this, gangs of kids roaming medieval streets, But instead of smartphones, they're armed with sob stories and acrobatic tricks. These weren't your average troublemakers. They were survival artists. Medieval street children, or urchins, developed elaborate schemes that would make modern con artists jealous. They'd position themselves near churches during Mass, knowing guilt-ridden nobles would toss coins their way. Smart little devils, really. But here's where it gets interesting. These kids weren't just begging randomly. They formed actual gangs with hierarchies, territories, and specialized roles. Some were tumblers who performed backflips and handstands. Others were weepers, professional criers who could summon tears on command. Makes you wonder if Hollywood got its start in medieval alleyways, right? The really clever ones learned multiple languages to target foreign merchants. Imagine a 10-year-old switching from broken French to butchered German, all to squeeze a few extra pennies from traveling traders. These urchin gangs created their own family structures too. Older kids protected younger ones, sharing food and shelter. They had their own codes, their own justice systems. It was like a miniature society operating in the shadows of the real one. Well, speaking of shadows and survival, wait until you hear about the knights who depended on four-legged partners with intelligence that could literally save their lives in battle. Picture a knight in full armor. We're talking about a walking tank that could stop a crossbow bolt dead in its tracks. But here's the kicker. These metal masterpieces weren't just protection, they were basically medieval status symbols worth more than your average peasant's entire village. A full suit of plate armor weighed between 66 and 77 pounds. That's like strapping a large golden retriever to your body and then trying to sword fight. Most people think knights clanked around like tin cans, but skilled armorers crafted these suits so precisely that a knight could literally pick up a coin from the ground while fully suited up. The really wild part? Custom armor cost about the same as 15 war horses. We're talking serious money here, enough to buy a decent-sized farm. And if you got captured wearing the good stuff, enemies would sometimes forge replacement armor overnight just to ransom you back properly equipped. Talk about medieval customer service. But there's a darker side. Less experienced soldiers often died from heat exhaustion before they ever saw combat. The wait wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially lethal in summer campaigns. Makes you wonder what other medieval must-haves came with deadly side effects, right? Well, speaking of things that could literally heal or kill you depending on who was wielding them. Medieval kings had a bizarre side hustle that would make modern chiropractors jealous. They claimed they could cure a nasty skin disease called scrofula just by touching people. Yeah, you heard that right. Royal healing hands. This wasn't some underground operation either. The church officially endorsed it, turning these healing sessions into elaborate ceremonies. Kings would line up hundreds of sick folks, touch their necks, and supposedly cure their tuberculosis of the lymph nodes. Talk about putting pressure on your job performance. The French called it the king's evil, which is ironic since the king was supposed to be the cure, not the cause. English monarchs got so into this gig that they'd hand out special gold coins called touch pieces after each healing session. Nothing says I cured your disease like a commemorative coin, right? But here's the kicker. People actually believed it worked. Why? Because sometimes patients did get better, probably through good old-fashioned placebo effect mixed with natural recovery. The kings weren't complaining, though. This divine healing power basically proved they were God's chosen rulers on earth. Charles II reportedly touched over 90,000 people during his reign. That's more patients than most doctors see in a lifetime. Makes you wonder if he ever thought about charging co-pays. Speaking of medieval medical practices, wait until you hear about their approach to romance and marriage contracts. Medieval marriage wasn't exactly a fairy tale romance. Well, not unless your idea of romance involves haggling over dowries like you're buying a used cart at the market. Here's the thing nobody tells you about medieval love. It came with a literal price tag. Families negotiated marriage contracts that read more like business mergers than love letters. The bride's family paid a dowry, while the groom's family offered a bride price. Makes modern prenups look downright romantic, doesn't it? But wait, it gets weirder. Some regions charged actual taxes on marriages. That's right, the government wanted their cut of your happily ever after. Talk about wedding expenses you didn't see coming. These marriage taxes supposedly ensured only suitable unions took place, but really they just made the state richer. The Catholic Church also got in on the action, requiring fees for ceremonies and special permissions. Want to marry your third cousin? That'll cost extra. Need a quick ceremony during Lent? Better open your wallet wider. Political marriages were basically medieval stock trades. Daughters became bargaining chips for land deals, peace treaties, and trade agreements. Love was about as relevant as Wi-Fi passwords. The paperwork alone could bankrupt smaller families. Marriage contracts detailed everything from property rights to what happened if someone died childless. Speaking of medieval mysteries that boggle the mind, you won't believe what people thought about basic hygiene. Medieval harvest festivals weren't your typical church potlucks. These were epic community blowouts where everyone, and I mean everyone, got absolutely hammered together. Picture entire villages transforming into massive outdoor parties. Peasants who barely had enough grain to survive suddenly found themselves feasting like kings. Well, sort of. The irony? During harvest season, even the poorest folks could stuff their faces with fresh bread, roasted meats, and gallons of ale. These weren't quiet, dignified celebrations either. We're talking about full-blown medieval ragers that lasted for days. Dancing, singing, drinking contests, the works. Makes modern music festivals look tame, honestly. But here's what's fascinating. These festivals accidentally created the most egalitarian moments in medieval society. Lords mingled with serfs. Everyone shared the same tables, and social boundaries temporarily dissolved. Your typical feudal hierarchy? Gone faster than free beer at a college party? The religious angle made it even better. Since they were technically thanking God for the harvest, nobody could complain about the excess. Brilliant loophole, right? Sorry, Father, but the Lord wants us to celebrate his bounty. These massive community parties shape traditions we still follow today. Our modern Thanksgiving dinners, direct descendants of these medieval beer-fueled harvest celebrations. Speaking of medieval professionals, let me tell you about some folks who combine two very different job descriptions. Medieval tapestries weren't just fancy wall decorations for rich people. They were basically the Netflix of their time, telling epic stories thread by thread. But here's the kicker. Creating one of these masterpieces took decades. Some tapestries were literally passed down from grandmother to granddaughter before completion. The Bayeux Tapestry stretches over 230 feet long. That's like laying out 2.5 basketball courts end to end. And get this, it's not even technically a tapestry. It's embroidery. Medieval people were terrible at naming things, apparently. These fabric storytellers depicted everything from biblical scenes to grocery shopping adventures. Well, maybe not grocery shopping, but definitely everyday life mixed with grand battles and religious tales. The threads became time machines, preserving moments that would have been lost forever. The really wild part? Wealthy families used tapestries as portable insulation. When they moved between castles, because apparently having multiple castles was a thing, they'd roll up these priceless artworks and hang them in their new digs for warmth. Imagine using a Picasso as a blanket. Some tapestries contain secret messages woven into the designs. Political commentary disguised as pretty flowers and geometric patterns makes you wonder what medieval artists really thought about their bosses. Speaking of medieval craftspeople with attitude, wait until you hear about the barber surgeons who cut your hair and amputate your leg in the same appointment. Need a haircut and surgery? Well, in medieval times, you could get both from the same guy. Barber surgeons were the ultimate multi-talented professionals of their era. These weren't your typical corner barbershop owners. While trimming your beard, they'd also pull teeth, set broken bones, and perform amputations. Talk about a full-service experience. The red and white striped barber pole we still see today? That comes from these medieval jack-of-all-trades. Red represented blood, white symbolized bandages, and the pole itself mimicked the stick patients gripped during procedures. Here's the kicker. They learned their craft through apprenticeships, not medical school. Your barber might have zero formal training beyond watching someone else hack off limbs. Makes you appreciate modern licensing requirements, doesn't it? But here's what's truly bizarre. They were often more successful than university-trained physicians. While doctors debated theoretical humors and consulted ancient texts, barber surgeons got their hands dirty with real experience. They understood practical anatomy because they actually cut people open regularly. The guild system regulated these multi-skilled workers, ensuring standards existed, though those standards were, let's say, flexible by today's measures. A steady hand for shaving translated surprisingly well to surgical precision. However, there's something even stranger about medieval medical practices that'll make barber surgeons seem perfectly reasonable. Picture medieval monks wandering through carefully tended gardens, not picking flowers for decoration, but hunting for life-saving remedies. These weren't your grandmother's vegetable patches. They were sophisticated pharmaceutical laboratories disguised as peaceful sanctuaries. Apothecary gardens served as the original drugstores, where every plant had a purpose. Monks meticulously cultivated herbs like foxglove for heart conditions, willow bark for pain relief, and chamomile for digestive troubles. Well, at least they tried to match the right plant with the right problem. But here's where things get deliciously dark. Many gardens included what they cheerfully called poison corners, dedicated sections for growing deadly plants specifically for experimental study. Nothing says holy sanctuary like a patch of hemlock next to the healing herbs, right? These green thumb monks kept detailed records of every plant's properties, essentially creating the first herbal encyclopedias. Their observations formed the foundation of botanical medicine that we still reference today. Some of their remedies actually worked, though others probably sent patients straight to meet their maker. The irony? While they were growing plants to heal bodies, they were simultaneously cultivating knowledge that would eventually challenge the church's monopoly on medical authority. Speaking of medieval medical practices that raise eyebrows, wait until you hear about the traveling tooth pullers who combined dental work with street entertainment. Picture this. You're walking through a medieval village when suddenly you hear screaming, dramatic music, and what sounds like a street performance. But it's not a show. It's the local tooth puller at work. These traveling dental experts roamed from town to town with nothing more than rusty pliers and questionable hygiene. Well, that's not entirely fair. They also brought entertainment. See, these tooth pullers knew their job was terrifying, so they turned it into theater. They'd hire musicians, tell jokes, and sometimes even juggle before yanking out your molars. The whole spectacle served a purpose beyond showmanship. The music drowned out the screams, and the comedy distracted patients from the fact that anesthesia wouldn't be invented for another few centuries. Makes your last dental visit seem like a spa day, right? But here's where it gets really wild. More. People died from tooth extraction then actually felt better afterward. These professionals had zero medical training and often caused massive infections. They'd literally pull the wrong tooth, break your jaw, or leave fragments behind. The truly bizarre part? They mixed prayer with pliers. Many tooth pullers genuinely believed that chanting the right incantation while extracting would prevent complications. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Speaking of questionable medieval medical practices, wait until you hear what physicians were doing underground in secret gatherings. Picture medieval Christians sneaking into ancient burial chambers for secret parties. Well, that's exactly what happened during catacomb festivals. These underground celebrations mixed religion with pure madness. People would descend into dark tunnels lined with bones and painted murals, carrying flickering candles that cast eerie shadows on decomposing walls. Makes your local church potluck seem pretty tame, right? But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't just spooky gatherings for kicks. Communities used catacombs for coming-of-age ceremonies, religious rites, and yes, actual feasts among the dead. Think of it as the medieval version of extreme dining experiences, except your table mates had been there for centuries. The atmosphere was deliberately theatrical, candles everywhere, ancient bones arranged as decorations, and those haunting painted murals telling stories of saints and sinners. Some participants claimed they could commune with spirits or receive divine visions in these sacred spaces. Church authorities weren't thrilled about this underground party scene. Records show many catacomb festivals were officially banned for moral dangers. Apparently, mixing wine, darkness, and death made people a bit too adventurous for medieval sensibilities. These events strengthened community bonds through shared terror and reverence. Nothing brings people together quite like celebrating life while surrounded by reminders of mortality. And speaking of medieval parties that authorities tried to control, medieval mirrors weren't the crystal clear reflections we're used to today. They were polished metal discs that gave you about as much clarity as looking at yourself in a spoon. But here's the kicker. People treated these blurry metal circles like they were worth their weight in gold. A decent mirror could cost more than a horse. That's like paying $50,000 for a funhouse reflection. Wealthy nobles had servants whose entire job was polishing these things daily. Talk about a specialized career path. But wait, it gets weirder. People genuinely believe mirrors could trap souls or reveal spirits lurking nearby. Some folks refused to look into them after dark, convinced they'd see something staring back that shouldn't be there. Medieval horror movies would have been terrifying with beliefs like that floating around. The really wild part? Courts used mirrors as the ultimate flex. Having multiple mirrors meant you'd basically won medieval life. Kings would position them strategically so visitors would catch glimpses of themselves and remember exactly who they were dealing with. Pretty clever psychological warfare, if you ask me. These distorted reflections shaped how people saw themselves, literally and figuratively. Makes you wonder how different self-perception might have been when your mirror made you look like a funky medieval caricature. Speaking of medieval entertainment, traveling performers had their own fascinating secrets. Picture a medieval town square buzzing with excitement. Well, here comes a wandering minstrel with his lute, ready to drop the hottest gossip from 3 kingdoms away. These guys were basically the medieval internet, social media, and entertainment industry all rolled into one person. Minstrels didn't just strum pretty songs about love and roses. They were walking newspapers who could make or break a king's reputation faster than you could say trending topic. One catchy ballad about a corrupt lord, that guy's political career was toast. Think of them as medieval influencers, except their follower count was measured in actual crowds, not digital likes. But here's where it gets really interesting. These musical nomads often earned more coin during festival seasons than local blacksmiths or bakers made all year. Not bad for someone whose office was literally the road, right? The smart ones knew exactly how to read their audience. Performing for nobles, time for elegant courtly romance, tavern full of farmers. Bring out the bawdy jokes and drinking songs. They were masters of knowing their market before marketing was even a thing. Some minstrels even received legal protection as bearers of culture. Imagine having diplomatic immunity because you could carry a tune. But while these musical messengers shaped hearts and minds, medieval cities faced a much less romantic problem that required equally specialized professionals. Medieval cities had a serious problem: rats everywhere. These weren't your average house mice. We're talking about armies of disease-carrying rodents that could wipe out entire food stores overnight. Well, enter the rat catchers, the unsung heroes of medieval pest control. These guys were basically the Navy SEALs of vermin warfare. They'd show up with an arsenal that would make a modern exterminator jealous: traps, ferrets, and sometimes even trained hunting dogs. The ferrets were particularly effective because they could chase rats into their tunnels, kind of like sending a tiny missile into enemy territory. But here's where it gets interesting. Many cities paid rat catchers by the tail. Imagine explaining that job at a medieval dinner party. Oh, I collect rat tails for a living. Talk about conversation starters. Some entrepreneurial rat catchers figured out they could breed rats just to kill them for the bounty. Medieval side hustles were wild. The really successful ones became municipal employees. Cities would actually provide housing and steady wages because good rat catchers were worth their weight in gold. Makes sense, right? One rat catcher could prevent famines and plagues that would devastate entire populations. Speaking of preventing plagues, medieval physicians had their own bizarre solutions for dealing with disease. Medieval doctors had a truly disturbing secret ingredient in their medicine cabinets: human remains. Yeah, you heard that right. They literally prescribed dead people as medicine. Powdered skull was considered a top-tier remedy for epilepsy. Makes your daily vitamins seem pretty tame, doesn't it? Physicians would grind up skulls, mix them into potions, and serve them to patients with complete confidence. The fresher the corpse, the better the medicine, they believed. But wait, it gets weirder. Mummy powder became the Rolex of medieval remedies. Wealthy patients paid outrageous prices for imported Egyptian mummies, ground into fine powder. These ancient corpses were supposedly miracle cures for bleeding disorders and various ailments. The logic was twisted but consistent in their minds. They figured death held some mystical power that could cure the living, like borrowing strength from the deceased. Medieval physicians treated human remains like we treat exotic supplements today: expensive, rare, and supposedly life-changing. Here's the kicker. This wasn't some underground practice. Respectable doctors openly prescribed corpse medicine across Europe. Medical texts included detailed recipes for preparing human-based remedies. The whole thing was perfectly legal and socially acceptable. Of course, patients probably caught more diseases than they cured, considering they were literally eating decomposed bodies. But hey, at least they felt confident about their treatment plan, right? Speaking of confidence and questionable medieval innovations, wait until you hear about their revolutionary approach to measuring time. Picture a world where nobody agrees on what time it is. One monastery rings bells at dawn, another waits for full sunrise. Towns operate on pure guesswork. Chaos, right? Then came the mechanical clock revolution in the 13th and 14th centuries. These weren't your grandpa's wristwatches. We're talking massive tower contraptions that literally changed civilization. The first mechanical clocks used weights, gears, and escapements to tick away the hours with shocking precision. But here's the kicker. These clocks weren't just timepieces, they were medieval entertainment systems. Many featured elaborate automata that would pop out on the hour. Dancing figures, jousting knights, even mechanical roosters that crowed. The clock in Strasbourg had a parade of apostles marching around Christ every noon. Talk about dinner and a show, the real game changer. Standardized time meant coordinated work schedules. No more, I'll meet you when the sun's kinda high-ish. Suddenly, everyone knew exactly when to start work, attend mass, or close shop. It was like giving medieval society a universal remote control. These mechanical marvels cost fortunes to build and maintain. Only the wealthiest cities could afford them, making public clocks the ultimate status symbol. Venice, Paris, London, they all competed for the most impressive timekeeper. Well, speaking of medieval society's quirks, you won't believe the bizarre superstitions that controlled people's daily decisions. Medieval people had some seriously strange superstitions that would make your horoscope-checking aunt look rational. Black cats weren't just unlucky pets. They were basically furry death omens walking around on 4 legs. Makes you wonder how any cats survived the Middle Ages, right? But here's where it gets really weird. Spilling salt wasn't just wasteful, it was practically signing your own death warrant. People would throw pinches over their left shoulder like their lives depended on it, which, according to them, it absolutely did. The left shoulder thing? That's where the devil supposedly hung out, waiting to cause trouble. Walking under ladders was another big no-no. Though, honestly, that one actually makes sense. Have you ever seen medieval construction safety standards? Those ladders were basically death traps held together with hope and splinters. Then there's the really bizarre stuff. People believed that breaking a mirror cursed you for 7 years. Considering mirrors cost more than most people's houses, breaking one probably did ruin your finances for 7 years. Talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy. These weren't just random quirks either. Superstitions influenced everything from when farmers planted crops to how judges decided court cases. Wedding dates, business deals, even which direction you stirred your porridge. It all mattered. The funny thing, some of these beliefs stuck around so well that your grandmother probably still follows half of them.